I walked down the aisle alone on my wedding day. No father to give me away. No mother crying tears of joy. Because I was marrying a plumber, and that apparently was beneath them. "We're not funding this circus," my mother had said, her voice dripping with disgust. So I married the love of my life in a simple ceremony, surrounded by friends who actually cared. I thought that would be the end of it, that I'd finally be free from their judgment. I was wrong. The next morning, my phone exploded with messages. Our wedding photos were everywhere on TV, in newspapers, across every social media platform. And the headline, "Billionaire Tech Innovator Marries in Private Ceremony." That's when my mother's coffee cup hit the floor. Because the plumber she'd mocked, he was the same student she'd humiliated in her classroom 15 years ago, the one she told would never amount to anything. And now she was about to learn exactly what it costs to measure a person's worth by their job title. This is the story of how my family begged for forgiveness and why I made them earn every single second of it. My name is Ashley Reed. I'm 36 years old and I've spent most of my adult life designing beautiful spaces for other people's spaces where they feel seen, valued, and at home. I'm an interior designer here in Ohio, and I'm good at what I do. But for the longest time, I couldn't design a life where I felt those same things for myself, especially not around my own family. I should have known better than to accept my mother's dinner invitation that Friday night. Margaret Reed didn't do casual family dinners. She did performances, and I was always cast in the same role, the forgettable daughter, the one who didn't quite measure up, the one who existed in the margins of every family photograph and every conversation. My younger sister Lily arrived first, of course, gliding through the front door in a designer dress I knew cost more than my monthly rent. She worked in marketing for some trendy firm downtown, the kind of job that sounded impressive at cocktail parties. Mother greeted her with the kind of warm embrace she reserved exclusively for her golden child, cooing over Lily's new hairstyle and asking about her latest promotion. When I walked in 10 minutes later, Mother glanced up from her conversation, as if I were a piece of furniture that had been rearranged without her permission. "Oh, Ashley, you're here." Not a hug, not even a smile, just acknowledgement that I existed barely. The dinner guests arrived shortly after some of Mother's friends from the country club people, whose approval she cultivated like rare orchids. I sat at the far end of the table, the seat I'd occupied my entire life, watching Lily charm everyone with the stories about her career and her social life. She had a gift for making everything sound more exciting than it actually was. Mother beamed at her like she'd personally invented success. Then, Mrs. Patterson, one of Mother's oldest friends, turned to me, with the kind of polite curiosity people reserve for distant acquaintances. "And Ashley, dear, are you seeing anyone special?" Before I could answer, Mother laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was the laugh of someone about to deliver a punchline at someone else's expense. "Ashley's still waiting for her prince to come," Mother said, her voice dripping with amusement. "Though, I'm afraid she's not exactly Cinderella material." The table went quiet for just a moment, that awful silence that comes right before social humiliation becomes irreversible. Then Mother continued, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Ashley will never marry up. She's too ordinary for that." The words landed like a slap. Too ordinary. As if I were a beige sofa in a room full of antiques. As if my entire existence could be summarized in one dismissive adjective. Lily didn't defend me. Father, seated at the head of the table, suddenly became very interested in cutting his steak. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others nodding along as if Mother had simply stated an obvious fact. I finished my meal in silence, excused myself as soon as it was socially acceptable, and drove home through streets that blurred behind tears I refused to let fall until I was safely alone. When I got home, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out the old family photo albums, the ones Mother kept in matching leather binders, as proof of our picture-perfect life. I flipped through page after page, and that's when I saw it clearly for the first time. In nearly every photo, I was either missing entirely or pushed to the very edge of the frame, half-cropped, barely visible. Lily was always centered, always glowing, always the star. I had spent my whole life being invisible in my own family. That night, I made a promise to myself I would never let them define my worth again. The promise I made that night wasn't just words whispered into the darkness of my bedroom. It was a decision that settled deep in my bones, the kind of resolution that changes how you move through the world. I woke up the next morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. If I was going to stop letting my family define me, I needed to clear out the old versions of myself I'd been carrying around like dead weight. I started with my apartment. It was small, but mine a third-floor walk-up with good light and creaky hardwood floors that I'd chosen specifically because my mother hated it. Too modest, she'd said when I first moved in. Too beneath what a Reed should accept. But I loved it. It was the first place that had ever truly felt like home. That Saturday, I pulled out boxes from the back of my closet. The ones I'd been meaning to sort through for years, but never had the courage to face. Old tax returns, college notebooks, expired warranties for appliances I no longer owned. The accumulated debris of a life lived quietly, carefully, without making too much noise or taking up too much space. At the bottom of the third box, beneath a stack of faded birthday cards from distant relatives, I found a manila folder I didn't remember packing. The edges were yellowed with age, the paper inside brittle and slightly musty. I opened it carefully and my breath caught in my throat. It was a photocopy of a letter on official university letterhead. The Parsons School of Design, New York City, one of the most prestigious design programs in the country. And it was addressed to me. "Dear Miss Reed," it began, "we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as a finalist for the Emerging Talent Scholarship in Interior Design." No? My hand started shaking. I remembered this letter. I remembered the surge of hope I'd felt when it arrived in the mail during my senior year of high school. I'd been 17, full of dreams about leaving Ohio and studying in New York, about finally becoming someone who mattered in a world beyond my mother's suffocating orbit. But I also remembered what happened next. My mother sitting me down at the kitchen table, her face serious and concerned. "You're too young to make a decision this big, Ashley. Let me handle the paperwork. I'll make sure everything is taken care of." I trusted her. Of course I had. She was my mother. What I hadn't remembered, what I'd somehow blocked out or convinced myself I'd imagined, was the stamp at the bottom of the letter. In harsh red ink, it read, "Declined by Guardian." I read it 3 times, each time hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Declined by Guardian, not declined by me, not I chose not to go, not to. Someone had made that choice for me, and I'd spent the last 18 years believing I simply hadn't been good enough. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. I grabbed my phone and searched for the university's registrar office. It took 20 minutes and 3 transfers before I reached someone in the archives department who could access records that old. Yes, I'm showing a scholarship application for an Ashley Reed from 18 years ago. The woman on the other end said, her voice professional and detached. "And yes, I see a decline letter was submitted in response." "Was it mailed or submitted in person?" I asked, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. "Let me check. It looks like it was mailed. We received it approximately 2 weeks after the acceptance notification was sent out." "And the signature on the letter, can you tell me what name was signed?" There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling. "The signature reads Ashley Reed." "Shit." My stomach dropped. "Can you describe the signature, what it looks like?" Another pause. I'm looking at the scanned copy now. It's in blue ink cursive writing. Honestly, it looks like most signatures, a bit hurried, somewhat illegible. Why do you ask? Because I never signed that letter, I said quietly. I never even saw it. The woman went silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had softened slightly. Miss Reed, I'm not sure what you're suggesting, but we did receive official correspondence declining the scholarship offer. Without evidence to the contrary, there's nothing I can do at this point. The scholarship was awarded to another candidate 18 years ago. I understand, I said, though I didn't. I didn't understand how my mother could have done this. I didn't understand how I'd let myself forget, or why I'd accepted the story she'd fed me about the school, deciding I wasn't ready after all. After I hung up, I sat on my living room floor, surrounded by boxes and old papers holding that photocopied letter, like it was evidence at a crime scene. Which, in a way, it was. My mother had stolen my signature and used it to reject the one opportunity that might have changed the trajectory of my entire life. I thought about calling her, demanding an explanation, forcing her to admit what she'd done. But I already knew what would happen. She'd deny it, twist the story, make me feel like I was being dramatic or remembering things wrong. She'd been doing it my whole life, rewriting history to suit whatever narrative made her look like the devoted mother, and me like the ungrateful daughter. I didn't have proof she'd forged my signature. I just had a photocopy of a letter with red ink and a memory that had been carefully edited over the years until I couldn't trust my own version of events anymore. But now, I knew the truth, even if I couldn't prove it. My mother hadn't just dismissed my dreams as impractical or unrealistic. She'd actively sabotaged them. She'd made sure I stayed small, stayed close, stayed ordinary. For years, I thought I wasn't good enough. I never knew someone had forged my signature to steal my future. The weeks after that discovery were some of the hardest of my life. I moved through my days in a fog of anger and grief, mourning not just the opportunity I'd lost, but the version of myself I might have become. I threw myself into work taking on more clients than I could reasonably handle, staying late at the office, to avoid going home to an empty apartment where I'd just sit and think about all the ways my mother had shaped my life without my consent. It was during one of those long evenings at the office, around 8 o'clock on a Thursday, when I heard the dripping sound. At first I thought I was imagining it, some auditory hallucination, brought on by exhaustion and too much coffee. But when I walked to the small kitchenette we shared with the accounting firm next door, I found water pooling on the floor beneath the sink, a steady drip that had already soaked through the cabinet bottom and was spreading across the tile. I tried tightening the pipes myself, but whatever was broken was beyond my limited plumbing knowledge. I called the building's emergency maintenance line and was told someone would be there within the hour. I sat at my desk listening to the rhythmic drip and feeling like it was somehow symbolic of my life slowly leaking away while I watched helplessly. The plumber arrived 45 minutes later. I heard his knock and opened the door to find a man in his late 30s wearing work pants and a plain grey shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He had dark hair that was slightly too long, like he'd been meaning to get a haircut for weeks, but kept forgetting, and the kind of hands that looked capable of fixing anything. But it was his eyes that caught me. They were dark brown, almost black in the dim hallway light, and they carried something I recognised immediately because I saw it in my own mirror every morning. Old pain carefully contained. "I'm Mark," he said simply. "You called about a leak." I showed him to the kitchenette, and he knelt down to examine the pipes, moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested he'd done this thousands of times before. I should have gone back to my desk, let him work in peace, but something about his presence was calming in a way I hadn't expected. So I stayed, leaning against the doorframe watching him work. "It's the compression fitting," he said after a few minutes, his voice low and thoughtful. "Probably been loose for a while. Sometimes these things fail slowly, so gradually you don't notice until there's a crisis." "Story of my life?" I said, and then immediately regretted it because I didn't make a habit of sharing personal observations with strangers. but he looked up at me and there was something in his expression that wasn't pity or curiosity. It was understanding. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Mine too." "Mine gay?" He worked in silence for a while, and I found myself wanting to fill the space between us with words. "Have you always been a plumber?" I asked. "No," he said, tightening something with a wrench. "I studied mechanical engineering, got halfway through a graduate program before I realised I was building a life I didn't actually want." "What made you realise that?" He sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on a rag. "I lost faith in people who measure success by titles instead of character. I watched colleagues sabotage each other for promotions, saw professors crush students they didn't think were worthy of their time." He paused, something dark crossing his face. "I realised I'd rather fix people's pipes honestly than climb a ladder built on other people's backs." His words struck something deep inside me, and I found myself telling him about my interior design work, about how I tried to create spaces where people felt valued and seen. We talked for nearly an hour after he finished the repair, standing in that tiny kitchenette like two people who'd stumbled into an unexpected connection. When he left, he handed me his card. "In case you have any other leaks," he said with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I didn't expect to see him again, but 2 days later I ran into him at the hardware store near my apartment. We both laughed at the coincidence stood in the paint aisle, talking about the difference between eggshell and satin finishes, and somehow ended up getting coffee at the shop next door. Then, it happened again. The farmer's market on Sunday morning. The park, where I sometimes walked to clear my head. The coffee shop where I worked on Saturdays when I needed a change of scenery. At first, we joked about fate or cosmic intervention, but by the second month, we'd stopped pretending it was coincidence and started deliberately choosing to see each other. Mark was unlike anyone I'd ever dated. He didn't talk about career ambitions or networking opportunities. He didn't name drop or try to impress me with where he'd been or who he knew. He talked about books and music and what it meant to build something with your own hands. He listened when I spoke, really listened like my words mattered, like I mattered. By the third month, I knew I was falling in love with him. And I knew with absolute certainty that my family would never approve. He was a plumber. He drove a 10-year-old truck. He lived in a modest apartment and seemed perfectly content with a life that my mother would consider several social classes beneath acceptable. Everything about him would confirm her worst assumptions about my inability to marry up to choose someone worthy of the Reed family name. I tried to keep him separate from that part of my life for as long as I could. But eventually, during one of my mother's rare check-in phone calls, the kind where she asked perfunctory questions without really wanting answers, I mentioned I was seeing someone. The silence on the other end of the line lasted just a beat too long. Then her voice came back sharp, with interest she rarely showed in my life. "Oh, and what does this mystery man do?" I should have lied. I should have said he was in business or consulting or anything vague enough to pass her initial screening. But I was tired of lying, tired of managing her expectations, tired of making myself smaller to fit into her narrow definition of acceptable. "He's a plumber," I said. Another silence. Then, in a tone that was almost cheerful, almost warm, she said, "Well, you'll have to bring him over for dinner. Let us meet this mystery man of yours." I should have known it was a trap. I spent the entire week before the dinner trying to prepare Mark for what he was walking into. Though, I'm not sure anyone can truly be prepared for Margaret Reed in full performance mode. I warned him that my mother could be critical, that she had very specific ideas about what constituted success, that she might ask uncomfortable questions. What I didn't tell him was that I was terrified he'd see me through their eyes and realise I came from people who measured human worth like it was something that could be calculated on a spreadsheet. Mark just smiled that quiet smile of his and said, "I've dealt with difficult people before. I'll be fine." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that love could somehow insulate us from my family's judgment, that his calm confidence could withstand my mother's precision cruelty. But as we pulled up to my childhood home on Friday evening, my hands were shaking so badly, I could barely unbuckle my seatbelt. The house looked exactly as it always had, imposing, immaculate, designed to impress rather than welcome. Mark looked up at it and didn't say anything, but I saw something shift in his expression, a slight tightening around his eyes that made me wonder if he was regretting agreeing to this. My mother opened the door before we even reached it, as if she'd been watching from the window. She was dressed in what I called her casual, elegant uniform, expensive slacks, and a silk blouse that probably cost more than Mark made in a week. Her eyes went immediately to Mark, travelling from his face down to his shoes, and back up again in one long, assessing look that made my skin crawl. "So you're the plumber," she said. Not hello, not nice to meet you, just a statement of fact delivered like an accusation. Mark extended his hand. "Mark Chen, it's nice to meet you, Mrs. Reed." She took his hand briefly, the kind of handshake you give someone you're already planning to forget. "Do come in. Dinner's almost ready." The dining room was set with the good china, the kind my mother only brought out when she wanted to emphasize the gap between her world and someone else's. Lily was already seated wearing a dress that probably came straight from some boutique runway. She looked Mark over with barely concealed amusement, then caught my eye and smirked in a way that made me want to leave immediately. My father sat at the head of the table, absorbed in his phone, barely glancing up when we entered. He'd perfected the art of being present without actually participating, a skill I now recognized as cowardice rather than neutrality. We took our seats, and for a few minutes there was the awkward small talk that happens when people who don't like each other pretend to be civilized. My mother asked Mark where he was from, where he went to school, harmless questions that felt like she was building a case file. Then, the interrogation really began. "So, Mark," my mother said, cutting her chicken with surgical precision. "Ashley mentioned you're a plumber. Is that something you plan to do long-term, or is it more of a transitional career?" "I find the work fulfilling," Mark said evenly. "I like solving problems with my hands." "How admirable," my mother said in a tone that suggested it was anything but. "And financially, is it stable? I imagine it must be challenging to plan for the future in a trade profession." I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment. "Mum, that's not... I'm just trying to understand your boyfriend's prospects, Ashley. Surely that's not unreasonable." Mark put his hand on my knee under the table, a gentle pressure that said, "It's okay, I can handle this." "I make a comfortable living, Mrs. Reed. Enough to support myself and contribute to a shared future, if that's what you're asking." "And education," my mother continued as if he hadn't spoken. "Ashley mentioned you studied engineering. Why leave a field with so much more potential?" "I left because I didn't like the person I was becoming in that environment," Mark said, and there was something in his voice now, something harder. "I chose character over career advancement. Not everyone finds that trade-off worthwhile." Lily laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the tension. "Well, that's certainly one way to rationalize underachievement." "Lily," my father said quietly, but he didn't look up from his plate, and his intervention had all the force of a whisper in a hurricane. My mother leaned back in her chair, studying Mark, like he was a painting she was considering buying, but suspected was a forgery. "You know, Mark, I'm sure you're a perfectly nice person, but surely you can understand a mother's concern when her daughter chooses someone so far outside her social circle. Ashley could have done so much better." The words hung in the air like poison gas. I opened my mouth to respond, to defend Mark, to finally tell my mother exactly what I thought of her and her suffocating definitions of worth. But before I could speak, Mark stood up slowly, carefully setting his napkin beside his plate. "Thank you for dinner, Mrs. Reed," he said, his voice controlled but cold. "I think it's time for us to go." I stood immediately grateful for the exit, but hating that it had come to this. As we moved toward the door, my mother remained seated, her expression one of satisfied vindication, as if Mark's departure only proved her point about his inadequacy. We were almost to the hallway when Mark stopped. He turned back to look at my mother, his head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowed in concentration. The room went very still. "You know," he said slowly, "you look familiar. Have we met before?" Something flashed across my mother's face so quick I almost missed it. Not confusion, not polite interest. It was something closer to recognition, maybe even fear, quickly masked behind her usual cool composure. "I don't believe so," she said, but her voice was different now, less certain. "I'm sure I would remember." Mark held her gaze for a long moment, and I could feel some current passing between them that I didn't understand, some unspoken communication that excluded everyone else in the room. "Perhaps," he said finally, and then he took my hand and we left. In the car, I apologized over and over, furious at my family, and humiliated that he'd witnessed exactly what I tried to protect him from. But Mark was quiet, distracted, his eyes unfocused as he drove. "Are you okay?" I finally asked. "Yeah," he said, but he didn't sound okay. He sounded like someone trying to solve a puzzle. "I just can't shake the feeling that I've seen your mother before." I thought he was just being polite. I didn't realize he meant it literally. The comment about my mother looking familiar bothered me more than I wanted to admit. For days after that terrible dinner, I found myself replaying the moment in my mind, trying to decode the expression that had crossed her face when Mark asked if they'd met before. It wasn't the polite confusion of someone trying to place a vaguely familiar face. It was something sharper, more complicated. Almost like recognition mixed with something I couldn't quite identify. I didn't bring it up with Mark immediately. Part of me was still too angry and humiliated about how my family had treated him, and I didn't want to give them any more space in our relationship than they'd already taken. I'd stopped answering my mother's calls after that night, let her messages pile up unheard, and found that the silence was more peaceful than I'd expected. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to manage her expectations or smooth over her disappointments. I was just done. Mark and I fell into an easy rhythm over the following weeks. He'd come over after work, still smelling faintly of copper pipes and honest labour, and we'd cook dinner together in my small kitchen, talking about everything and nothing. He made me laugh in ways I hadn't in years, not with practiced jokes, but with dry observations about the world that showed he was paying attention to details most people missed. But there were moments when I'd catch him staring into space, his mind somewhere else entirely, and I'd wonder what he was thinking about, what pieces of his past he was still carrying. He told me he'd studied engineering, that he'd left that world behind, but I'd never pushed for details. Everyone has things they don't want to talk about, chapters they've closed. I understood that better than most. It was about a month after the dinner when I finally asked him directly. We were at his apartment, a modest one-bedroom in an older building that he'd made comfortable in that particular way of people who know how things work and how to fix them. Everything functioned perfectly. No dripping faucets, no loose door handles, no flickering lights. It was the home of someone who took care of what he had. I was looking for a book I'd left there the week before when I noticed the magazine on his bookshelf, tucked between a repair manual and a novel. It was a Forbes issue from several years ago, the cover creased and faded. And there, looking back at me from the glossy surface, was Mark's face. Not quite the Mark I knew. This version was younger, wearing an expensive suit, his hair styled differently. The headline read, "Tech's New Visionaries, the Innovators Reshaping Our Future." His face had been violently crossed out with black marker harsh lines that nearly tore through the paper. I stood there holding the magazine, my heart pounding, trying to reconcile the man in the photo with the man who'd fixed my office leak and talked to me about the difference between eggshell and satin paint finishes. "You weren't supposed to see that," Mark said quietly from the doorway. I turned to face him. He wasn't angry or defensive, just resigned, like he'd known this moment would come eventually. "Who are you?" I asked, and immediately regretted how it sounded, like I was accusing him of being an imposter. He walked over and took the magazine from my hands, looking at the crossed-out face with something that might have been grief. "That person doesn't exist anymore," he said quietly. We sat down on his worn couch and he told me everything. How he'd founded a tech startup in his late 20s, something to do with sustainable energy solutions that I didn't fully understand, but that had apparently been revolutionary. How he'd poured everything he had into it, not just money, but his idealism, his belief that innovation could actually make the world better. I was naive, he said, his voice distant. I thought if you built something good enough, worked hard enough, believed in it enough, that would be sufficient. I didn't understand that in that world, integrity is just another word for exploitable weakness. His business partners had been people he'd trusted friends from graduate school who'd seemed to share his vision. The investors had been prestigious firms with impeccable reputations, but slowly, methodically, they'd maneuvered him out of his own company. Board meetings where he was outvoted, legal maneuvers he didn't understand until it was too late. A hostile takeover dressed up in the language of fiscal responsibility and strategic restructuring. They took everything, he said. The company, the patents, the vision. They turned it into exactly the kind of profit-maximizing machine I'd been trying to avoid. And legally, there was nothing I could do. I'd signed contracts I hadn't read carefully enough, trusted people who saw my trust as stupidity. The money had been the least of it, he told me. What broke him was watching people he'd considered friends testify in boardrooms that he was unstable, unrealistic, a dreamer who didn't understand real business. They'd systematically destroyed his credibility while stealing his life's work. I had a breakdown, he said simply. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies. The quiet kind, where you wake up one morning and realize you don't recognize the person you've become. I'd been so consumed with fighting them, with trying to prove I was right, that I'd lost track of why I'd started in the first place. So he'd walked away, sold everything he had left, disappeared from that world entirely, and started over with work that was simple and honest and couldn't be twisted into something ugly by people who measured success in quarterly earnings. I know it probably seems like I'm running away, he said, looking at me with those eyes that carried so much old pain. And maybe I am, but I'd rather fix people's pipes and sleep at night than build empires on compromised principles. I reached for his hand. You're not running away. You're protecting something in yourself that they tried to destroy. He looked at me then with such naked gratitude that I felt something crack open in my chest. We'd both been wounded by people who were supposed to care about us both, learn to build smaller, safer lives because the alternative had cost too much. Does it bother you, he asked, that I used to be someone impressive and chose to become ordinary? I thought about my mother's voice, Ashley will never marry up. She's too ordinary. I thought about all the years I'd believed that ordinary was another word for worthless. You're not ordinary, I said. You're real, and that's rarer than any title or bank account. He pulled me close then, and we sat in the quiet of his carefully maintained apartment, two people who'd been broken by the same kind of cruelty, finding something like peace in each other. I fell in love with who he was, not what he'd been. But destiny had other plans, and my parents were about to learn the truth the hard way. The proposal happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening in late spring, which somehow made it perfect. Mark had come over after work and we'd made pasta together in my small kitchen, talking about a project he was working on, and a difficult client I'd been dealing with. It was the kind of comfortable domesticity I'd never experienced before, the easy intimacy of two people who'd stopped performing for each other and just existed together. After dinner, we were washing dishes side by side when he suddenly went quiet. I looked over and saw him staring down at the soapy water in the sink, his jaw tight with something that looked like nervousness. Mark, you okay? He dried his hand slowly on the dish towel, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. It was beautifully crafted, smooth and polished with tiny hinges that looked like they'd been installed with meticulous care. I made this, he said, opening it to reveal a ring nestled inside. All of it. The ring wasn't like anything I'd ever seen in a jewelry store. The band was forged metal with a subtle hammered texture that caught the light. Set into it was a stone I couldn't immediately identify. Not a diamond, something darker and deeper, almost the colour of whiskey in sunlight. "It's tiger's eye," he said quietly. "I know it's not traditional, but I remembered you saying once that you liked how it changes depending on how you look at it, how the light shifts inside it, like it has depth most people miss if they don't pay attention." My throat tightened with emotion. He'd been listening, not just to what I said, but to who I was. "Ashley Reed," he said, and his voice was steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I know I can't give you the kind of life your family thinks you deserve. I can't give you country club memberships or designer clothes or a house that impresses people at dinner parties. But I can give you honesty. I can give you a partner who sees you, really sees you, and thinks you're extraordinary exactly as you are. Will you marry me?" I didn't even hesitate. "Yes," I said. And then I was crying and laughing at the same time, and he was sliding the ring onto my finger where it fit perfectly, because of course he'd somehow figured out my size without asking. For a few weeks, we existed in a bubble of happiness, making quiet plans and talking about the kind of wedding we wanted. Something small, we decided. Meaningful. With people who actually cared about us, rather than people we felt obligated to invite. We hadn't set a date yet, hadn't sent out any announcements. It was our secret, our joy, something pure that existed outside of everyone else's expectations. But eventually, I knew I had to tell my family. Not because I needed their blessing or their permission, but because I wanted to face them one final time and choose Mark openly, definitively, without shame or apology. I called my mother on a Saturday afternoon and told her I needed to talk to the family. She immediately assumed I was coming to apologise for my behaviour at the dinner for embarrassing them by bringing Mark in the first place. I didn't correct her. I just said I'd be there at 6. They were all waiting when I arrived, mother, father and Lily, arranged in the living room like a tribunal. My mother's face had that tight, expectant look that meant she was preparing to graciously accept my contrition and then explain in detail everything I'd done wrong. I didn't sit down. I stood in the doorway and held up my left hand so the ring caught the light. "Mark asked me to marry him," I said. I said yes. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the antique clock ticking on the mantel. Then my mother's face transformed pleasant expectation morphing into something cold and sharp. "No," she said simply, as if she had the authority to make that decision for me. "I'm not asking for permission," I said. "I'm telling you." My mother stood up, her posture rigid with controlled fury. "Ashley, I have tried to be patient with this little rebellion of yours, this phase you're going through. But I will not stand by and watch you throw your life away on a plumber with no prospects and no future. We're not funding this circus. If you marry him, you're on your own." "I don't want your money," I said, and I meant it. I never did. I just wanted you to see me as something other than a disappointment. Lily laughed from her position on the sofa, a sharp, cruel sound. "Oh, Ashley, did you really think any of us would support this? You're marrying a tradesman. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for us?" I looked at my father, who was studying his hands with intense concentration, his face carefully neutral. "Dad, you have nothing to say." He finally looked up, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't anger or disappointment. It was discomfort, the expression of a man who desperately wished he were anywhere else. "Your mother's right that it's a significant step," he said carefully. "Perhaps you should take more time to consider." "I've considered," I interrupted. "I've thought about nothing else. And I choose him." My mother's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Then you choose to do it without us. Without our support. Without our presence. Without our name behind you. If you walk out that door planning to marry that man, don't expect us at your wedding. Don't expect us to celebrate this mistake. And don't come crawling back when you realise what you've given up." I looked at each of them, my mother with her righteous fury, Lily with her smug satisfaction, my father with his cowardly silence. I'd spent my entire life trying to earn their approval, bending myself into shapes that might finally be acceptable to them. and in that moment, I realised I didn't want it anymore. Their approval came with too high a price, required too much of my soul. "I'd rather have real than rich," I said quietly. "I'd rather have him than your approval." I walked out of that house for what I thought would be the last time, and I didn't look back. In my car, I sat for a moment, letting the finality of it wash over me. I just lost my family, or maybe I'd finally freed myself from people who'd never really been family in the ways that mattered. I drove to Mark's apartment and told him everything. He held me while I cried, not for what I'd lost, but for what I'd never really had. And then we started planning our wedding, a small ceremony, in a park with friends, Kai, and colleagues who'd chosen to be in our lives rather than people who'd been assigned to us by blood. So I planned my wedding alone. Or so I thought. The morning of my wedding, I woke up alone in my apartment and felt an unexpected wave of peace. I'd been bracing myself for sadness, for the weight of my family's absence, to feel crushing on what should have been one of the happiest days of my life. But instead, as sunlight streamed through my bedroom window, all I felt was clarity. I was marrying a man who saw me, chose me, loved me without conditions or clauses. Everything else was just noise. My friend Rebecca came over early to help me get ready. She'd been my colleague at the design firm for years, one of those rare people who'd become family, in the truest sense, chosen, earned real. She'd cried when I told her about my parents' ultimatum, not out of pity, but out of anger on my behalf. "You look beautiful," she said as she helped me into the simple cream dress I'd chosen. It wasn't a traditional wedding gown, just a flowing sundress that made me feel like myself. No veil, no train, nothing that required a team of people to manage. I'd bought it at a boutique downtown, tried it on alone, and known immediately it was right. "I'm getting married," I said, looking at my reflection, and the reality of it hit me in a way it hadn't before. "I'm actually getting married." "To a man who loves you," Rebecca said firmly. "To a man who would walk through fire for you. Everything else is just details." The ceremony was set for late afternoon in a small park near the river, a place Mark and I had walked dozens of times during our months together. We'd rented a simple white arbor and arranged for chairs for about 30 people, friends, colleagues, the neighbours who'd become dear to us. Mark's handful of remaining friends from before his life imploded, my boss and her wife, people who knew us as we actually were not as someone's disappointing daughter or failed experiment. When Rebecca and I arrived, the space was more beautiful than I'd imagined. Someone had strung lights through the trees that would glow as evening fell. There were wildflowers in mason jars on each chair, simple and perfect. Mark stood at the front in a dark suit, his hands clasped in front of him, his face already emotional, even though nothing had started yet. Our friend James, who'd gotten ordained online specifically for this purpose, stood ready to officiate. He grinned at me as I approached, and I felt suddenly overwhelmingly grateful for this community we'd built, these people who'd shown up not out of obligation, but out of love. There was no music, no processional. I decided to walk myself down the aisle, because I was giving myself to this marriage, making this choice with my own agency and my own power. No one was giving me away because I wasn't property to be transferred. I was a woman choosing her partner, her future, her life. As I walked toward Mark between those rows of chairs, I saw him start to cry. Not subtle tears, but the kind of open emotion that comes from someone who stopped hiding. I felt my own tears start, and by the time I reached him, we were both laughing through them, and James had to pause for a moment to let us compose ourselves. "We're a mess," Mark whispered, and I nodded, unable to speak. James began the ceremony with words about love and choice and the courage it takes to build something real in a world that often values appearance over substance. Then it was time for our vows. Mark went first, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Ashley, you saw me when I was invisible. You loved me when I felt unlovable. You chose me when I was just a plumber who'd given up on ambition. You made me believe that being true to myself was enough. I promised to see you, love you, and choose you every day for the rest of my life." Then it was my turn. I'd written and rewritten my vows a dozen times, trying to capture what I felt, but in that moment, standing in front of him, and these people who'd become our family, the words I'd prepared felt wrong, too polished, too careful. So I spoke from my heart instead. Mark, my whole life I was taught that my value came from external things, from status, from money, from being impressive to the right people. I was taught that love had to be earned by making myself smaller, quieter, more acceptable. You taught me something different. You taught me that I was enough exactly as I was. You taught me that real is worth more than rich, that character matters more than credentials, that love doesn't require you to diminish yourself to deserve it. My voice cracked, but I pushed through. I'd rather have real than rich. I'd rather have you than approval. I'd rather have this life, this love, this truth, than anything my family could have given me. Mark pulled me close then before James had even finished the ceremony and held me so tight I could feel his heart beating against mine. There wasn't a dry eye in the small crowd. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of joy. James pronounced us married. We kissed while everyone cheered. We walked back down the aisle together, equal partners, and I felt lighter than I had in years. We were taking photos near the river, laughing with friends, when a man in his 50s approached. He was well dressed, but understated, carrying a professional camera with a telephoto lens. "Excuse me," he said politely, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "I was walking through the park and couldn't help but notice your beautiful ceremony. I'm a photographer, and the light right now is extraordinary. Would you mind if I took a few pictures just for the joy of capturing something genuine?" I looked at Mark, who shrugged. "Sure," I said. "That's kind of you." The photographer smiled and began taking photos as we continued celebrating with our guests. He was unobtrusive professional, capturing candid moments that our official photographer might have missed. After about 20 minutes, he approached again. "Thank you so much," he said. "You make a beautiful couple. Congratulations on your marriage." He handed me a business card with his contact information and walked away. I tucked it into my pocket without really looking at it, already turning back to Mark and our friends, back to the celebration, back to the beginning of our life together. It was the happiest day of my life. Simple, honest, real. By morning, those photos would be everywhere. And my parents would see a truth they never imagined. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the lace curtains of the bed and breakfast, and Mark's arm draped across my waist. For a moment, I just lay there watching him sleep, still unable to believe that this quiet, beautiful man was now my husband. Mrs. Ashley Chen. The name felt strange and wonderful in my mind. My phone was buzzing on the nightstand, a persistent vibration that had probably been going for a while. I reached for it reluctantly, expecting maybe a few congratulations messages from friends who couldn't make it to the wedding. What I found instead made my stomach drop. 63 missed calls, over 200 text messages. My email inbox showed 400 plus unread messages. My social media notifications had exceeded the app's ability to count them. "Mark," I said, my voice tight with confusion and growing alarm. "Mark, wake up." He stirred, blinking against the light, then saw my face and sat up immediately. "What's wrong?" I couldn't answer. I was scrolling through messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, from colleagues I barely knew, from numbers I didn't recognize. Most of them said variations of the same thing. "I can't believe you didn't tell me. This is incredible. I saw the news." With shaking hands, I opened my browser and searched my name. The results that loaded made the room tilt. The top headline from a major business publication read, "Billionaire tech innovator Mark Chen marries in private ceremony. The man who disappeared returns." Below it was a photo from our wedding. Me in my simple cream dress, Mark in his dark suit, both of us laughing, his forehead pressed against mine. We looked happy. We looked real. And, apparently, we looked newsworthy. "Oh no," Mark said quietly. He'd pulled out his own phone and was staring at a similar flood of notifications. "Oh no, Ashley, I'm so sorry." I read the article with growing disbelief. It detailed Mark's history, not the version he'd told me about being betrayed and losing everything, but a different story. How he'd founded Chen Technologies at 28. How his sustainable energy innovations had revolutionized the industry. How he'd sold the company 5 years ago for an undisclosed sum that analysts estimated in the billions. How he'd vanished from public life, completely becoming one of tech's greatest mysteries. Where is Mark Chen had apparently been a recurring question in industry circles, and now they had their answer. He'd been in Ohio, fixing pipes, falling in love with an interior designer named Ashley Reed. The article included quotes from industry leaders expressing shock from former colleagues trying to explain his disappearance from business professors using him as a case study in burnout and the cost of success. There were photos of him from before Young Polish standing in front of corporate logos and shaking hands with people whose names I recognised from news coverage. The photographer from yesterday wasn't just a photographer. He was a freelance journalist who'd apparently recognised Mark and realised he'd stumbled onto the story of the year. I looked at Mark, who was staring at his phone with an expression of resigned devastation. "You sold the company," I said slowly. "You didn't lose everything, you walked away." "It's complicated," he said. "I did lose everything that mattered, my ideals, my integrity, my sense of self. The money was just what was left after they'd taken everything real. I gave most of it away. Set up foundations, scholarships, programs for sustainable development. I kept enough to live simply and disappeared." He looked at me with something close to fear. "I should have told you. I wanted to, but I didn't know how to explain that I had money but chose not to use it, that I'd rather fix your office leak than go back to that world. I thought you'd think I was crazy or lying or using you somehow." "I don't think that," I said, though my mind was spinning. "I just need to process this." I got dressed quickly and told Mark I needed some air. He offered to come with me, but I needed to be alone with my thoughts to understand what this meant for us, for the simple life we'd planned together. I drove to the beach at Edgewater Park, one of my thinking spots, and walked along the shore as the morning sun turned the lake water silver. My phone kept buzzing, but I turned off all notifications. The only thing I could focus on was the sound of waves and the feeling of sand under my feet. I was sitting on a bench staring out at the water when an elderly woman sat down beside me. She had white hair and kind eyes and the sort of face that suggested she'd seen enough of life to understand most of it. "Beautiful morning," she said, not really asking for conversation, but offering it if I wanted. "Yes, I said automatically. She was quiet for a moment, then said gently, "You look like someone processing big news." I laughed, a sound with no humour in it. "You have no idea. Try me," she said. "I'm 82 years old. Not much surprises me anymore." I don't know why I told her. Maybe because she was a stranger, or because she reminded me of the grandmother I'd lost years ago, or because I desperately needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't invested in the answer. "I got married yesterday," I said. "Small ceremony, just close friends. My family didn't come because they thought I was marrying beneath me, a plumber with no prospects. And this morning I woke up to find out my husband is actually a billionaire who'd walked away from his fortune to live a simple life. The whole world is talking about it. And all I can think about is how my parents are going to react." The woman was quiet for a long moment, watching a seagull pick at something in the sand. "Did your family come to the wedding?" she finally asked. I shook my head. "Do they regret it now?" It was such a simple question, but it cut right to the heart of something I'd been circling around. Of course they would regret it. My mother would be mortified that she'd dismissed a billionaire as unworthy. My father would be calculating what business connections he'd missed. Lily would be furious that I'd somehow, despite everything, ended up with exactly the kind of success they'd always told me I'd never achieve. But here's what I realised sitting on that bench with a stranger who saw me more clearly than my family ever had. I didn't care anymore whether they regretted it. I smiled, and this time it was real. I stopped needing their approval the day I stopped waiting for their apology. The woman patted my hand. "Then you're going to be just fine, dear. Money or no money, You married someone you chose with your whole heart. That's rarer than any fortune." She stood and walked away, leaving me alone with the water and the sun and a future that looked nothing like I'd planned, but somehow felt exactly right. Meanwhile, across town, my parents were watching the same news, and the coffee cup slipped from my mother's hand. I didn't witness the moment it happened, but I would hear about it later from multiple sources, each adding their own details until I could picture it with perfect clarity. My mother's Saturday morning routine was sacred and unchanging: coffee in the sunroom, the morning news playing on the television she'd had installed specifically for this purpose, the newspaper folded beside her reading glasses. My father would join her with his own coffee, and they'd spend an hour in companionable silence, reviewing the world from their comfortable distance. That morning started like any other. Mother poured her coffee into the delicate china cup she preferred, added exactly 1 sugar cube, and settled into her chair. The television was already on, tuned to the business news channel she favoured, because it made her feel informed and important. Father sat across from her with the physical newspaper, the rustling of pages the only sound between them. The segment began innocuously enough. "In surprising news from the tech world," and the anchor said, "billionaire innovator Mark Chen has resurfaced after 5 years of complete silence from public life." My mother glanced up from her phone with mild interest. She'd always paid attention to business news, liked to drop names at dinner parties, as if proximity to knowledge equaled proximity to power. Then Mark's face filled the screen. Not as she'd seen him in her dining room 2 months ago, dressed in work clothes and looking uncomfortable under her scrutiny. This was an older photo, Mark in a suit, standing in front of a corporate logo, but it was unmistakably him. Chen, who founded Chen Technologies and revolutionized sustainable energy solutions before selling the company for an estimated $3 billion, has been the subject of intense speculation since his disappearance from the public eye. That mystery was solved yesterday when photos emerged from his private wedding ceremony in Cleveland, Ohio. The screen switched to our wedding photos. Me in my cream dress, Mark with tears on his face, both of us laughing, foreheads pressed together, completely lost in each other and oblivious to how that moment would detonate across the internet. The coffee cup slipped from my mother's hand. I'm told it shattered spectacularly, china, fragments scattering across the expensive Persian rug, coffee soaking into fabric that would never fully recover. "Oh my God!" my father said, the newspaper sliding forgotten from his hands. "That's Ashley." My mother was frozen, staring at the television, like it had personally betrayed her. The anchor continued talking about Mark's history, his innovations, his mysterious withdrawal from public life. Then came the detail that made my mother's face go absolutely white. Sources indicate Chen had been living quietly in Ohio for the past 5 years, working as a plumber while maintaining his anonymity. His new wife, Ashley Reed, is a local interior designer who apparently had no knowledge of her husband's previous identity or wealth. "He was the plumber," my mother whispered. "The plumber was Mark Chen." But that wasn't what had made her face drain of all colour. I learned later from Lily's panicked phone call to a mutual friend, who was more than happy to share the gossip, that my mother had suddenly remembered where she'd seen Mark before, not in her dining room, earlier, much earlier, 15 years ago when she'd been teaching business ethics as an adjunct professor at the local university, trying to maintain her sense of importance after my father's career had plateaued. She'd had a student named Mark Chen, a brilliant kid with idealistic notions about sustainable business and ethical innovation. She'd thought him naive, impractical, too focused on changing the world, and not focused enough on the realities of profit margins and market competition. She'd given him a D on his final project, told him his ideas were unrealistic, that he'd never make it in the real world with that kind of thinking. She'd written a letter to the scholarship committee recommending they not fund his graduate research. Too much of a dreamer, she'd written. Not enough practical business sense. And now, that dreamer was a billionaire. And he'd married her daughter. The daughter she'd called too ordinary, to ever marry up. Lily arrived at the house within an hour of seeing the news, her face blotchy from crying. She'd been fired from her job 3 weeks earlier, something she'd hidden from the family, too ashamed to admit she'd been caught manipulating expense reports and inflating her sales numbers. The company had been acquired by a larger tech firm, and the new management had done a thorough audit. They'd given her a choice to resign quietly and sign a repayment agreement or face prosecution for fraud. She'd chosen resignation and had been desperately job hunting ever since finding every door closed because a quick Google search revealed her employment termination for financial misconduct. The tech firm that had acquired her company, a subsidiary of Chen Holdings Mark's investment firm that he'd apparently maintained even while working as a plumber. "He fired me," Lily sobbed to our parents. "Mark Chen's company fired me. And now he's married to Ashley and everyone's going to know that I tried to, that I was..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The implication was clear enough. Lily had built her entire identity on being the successful sister, the one who'd done everything right while I fumbled through my ordinary life. And now that narrative had inverted so completely that she couldn't process it. My phone sitting face up on Mark's coffee table, where I could see it, but not hear it lit up with incoming calls. First my mother, then my father, then Lily, then my mother again. The calls came in waves, desperate and insistent. Mark, sitting beside me on the couch, watched the phone light up and go dark, light up and go dark. "You could answer?" he said quietly. "I'd understand if you wanted to." I shook my head. "They don't want to talk to me. They want to talk to Mrs. Mark Chen, wife of a billionaire. That's not who I am." "Yes, it is," he said, "among other things. But it's the only thing they care about right now." The calls continued for hours. Voicemails piled up. I could see the notifications, but didn't listen to them. Text messages appeared, each more desperate than the last. "Ashley, please call us. We need to talk to you. This is important. Don't do anything rash." Finally, as the sun was setting and my phone showed 47 missed calls from my family, I picked it up and typed a single message to the family group chat that I'd muted months ago. "I'm on my honeymoon. Don't wait up." I turned off my phone completely after that chat, the screen going dark with a finality that felt like closing a door I'd been trying to shut my entire life. Mark pulled me close. "How do you feel?" I thought about it carefully. How did I feel knowing my family was panicking, knowing they finally understood what they'd rejected, knowing they were scrambling to find a way to undo the damage they'd done? "Free," I said finally. "For the first time in my life, they need me, and I'm not ready to answer." The cabin in Hocking Hills was everything we needed. A small tucked away in the woods with no television and spotty cell service that made it easy to pretend the rest of the world didn't exist. We spent our days hiking through the forest, cooking simple meals in the tiny kitchen, and talking about everything except the media storm we'd left behind. Mark told me stories about his childhood in San Francisco, about his parents who'd immigrated from Taiwan and built a small restaurant that became a neighborhood institution. I told him about the version of myself I'd been before my family convinced me I wasn't enough. The girl who dreamed of studying in New York and designing spaces that made people feel truly at home. On the fourth night, we were sitting on the porch watching fireflies drift through the darkness when Mark spoke the truth we'd both been avoiding. "They'll come looking for us eventually," he said quietly. "Your family, once they realize you're serious about not answering, they'll show up in person. Are you ready for that?" I watched a firefly land on the porch railing, its light pulsing in the darkness. I don't know. Part of me wants to tell them exactly what I think of them. Part of me wants to just keep the door closed and never let them back in. "Both of those are valid choices," Mark said. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you. What would you do?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I'd probably listen to what they might have to say, not because they deserve it, but because you deserve closure. You deserve to look them in the eye with full knowledge of what you're worth or them try to explain why they couldn't see it before. That sounds like revenge dressed up as healing. He smiled slightly. Maybe a little, but mostly it's about you standing in your power. You've spent your whole life making yourself smaller for them. Let them see you at full size and decide what you want to do from there. We stayed in the cabin for a full week, and I have to admit, those 7 days were some of the most peaceful of my life. No expectations to manage, no personas, to maintain just two people figuring out how to build a life together. We made plans, real ones, about where we wanted to live, what kind of work Mark might want to do now that his anonymity was gone, whether I might finally pursue some of the bigger design projects I'd been too afraid to attempt. When we finally returned to Cleveland, the media attention had diminished to a manageable level. There were still occasional articles analysing Mark's return to public life, think pieces about billionaires who reject wealth and what it means for late-stage capitalism, but the feeding frenzy had moved on to newer scandals. What hadn't diminished were the messages from my family. I'd turned my phone back on during the drive home and watched as weeks of voicemails and texts loaded. My mother had called 63 times, Lily 37. My father, surprisingly 41, more than he'd probably called me in the previous 5 years combined. I didn't listen to the voicemails. I wasn't ready yet. Mark and I decided to stay at his apartment rather than mine. It felt safer, somehow like neutral territory, where I could control who had access. We spent the weekend settling back into routine, and I tried not to think about when the confrontation would come. I didn't have to wait long. The knock came early on Monday morning, just after 7. Mark had already left for a consultation. Yes, he was still taking plumbing jobs, said he'd honour his commitments regardless of what the media thought about a billionaire fixing pipes. And I was drinking coffee in my pyjamas, thinking about which client projects I needed to follow up on. The knock was hesitant, almost apologetic, not the confident rap of someone who expects to be welcomed. I looked through the peephole and felt my stomach drop. My parents stood in the hallway looking smaller than I'd ever seen them. My mother held an enormous bouquet of expensive flowers, roses, lilies, things chosen for their cost rather than their meaning. My father stood slightly behind her, his hands shoved in his pockets. His usual confident posture collapsed into something that looked almost like shame. I stood frozen for a moment, my hand on the doorknob. Every instinct I'd developed over 36 years told me to open the door, to let them in, to make this easier for them, because that's what I'd always done. I was the daughter who smoothed things over, who pretended everything was fine, who made herself smaller so everyone else could be comfortable. But I wasn't that daughter anymore. I unlocked the door and opened it slowly. My mother's face flooded with relief, her professional smile already forming the one she used when she needed to convince someone of something. My father looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was that hope, fear, calculation? Ashley, sweetheart, my mother began, her voice honey-sweet, the flowers extended like a peace offering. We've been so worried. We've been trying to reach you for weeks. I didn't take the flowers. I stood in the doorway, neither inviting them in nor closing the door in their faces. I just looked at them, really looked at them, and saw them clearly for the first time. My mother's desperation barely concealed beneath her practiced charm. My father's discomfort with having to actually participate in something emotionally difficult. The calculation in both their eyes as they tried to figure out how to handle this new version of me, the one who'd somehow married a billionaire despite, or perhaps because of their complete lack of faith in her. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice level and calm. My mother's smile flickered. "We want to talk to you, darling, to apologise. We made a terrible mistake and we'd like to make it right." After 2 months of silence, you'd like to make it right now, 2 weeks after the news broke about Mark. "We should have come sooner," my father said, speaking for the first time. "We should have supported you from the beginning. We were wrong." They stood there with apologies they'd clearly rehearsed, probably multiple times, workshopping the exact words that might unlock their daughter and her convenient new access to wealth and status. But I wasn't the same daughter who used to beg for their love. I stepped back from the doorway, not quite an invitation, but an acknowledgement that we couldn't have this conversation in the hallway where the neighbours might hear. My parents entered slowly, taking in Mark's modest apartment with barely concealed surprise. I saw my mother's eyes travel over the second-hand furniture. The simple kitchen, the complete absence of the luxury she'd clearly expected a billionaire's home to display. "He doesn't live like someone with money," my mother said, and I couldn't tell if it was a criticism or an observation. "He lives like someone who understands money isn't what makes a home," I replied, closing the door behind them. "You can put the flowers down anywhere. I'll find a vase later." It was a small cruelty, refusing to immediately accept their gift, but I found I didn't much care. They'd taught me about small cruelties over 36 years. I'd learnt from masters. My father sat on the couch without being invited, and after a moment's hesitation, my mother joined him. I stayed standing, maintaining the physical advantage of looking down at them. Another small power play, but one that felt necessary. "So," I said, "you wanted to apologise." My mother launched into what was clearly a prepared speech. How they'd been shocked by my choice, how they'd reacted poorly out of concern for my well-being, how they'd only wanted what was best for me. The words were polished smooth, each one selected to sound sincere without actually admitting genuine wrongdoing. It was a masterclass in non-apology apology, the kind where you express regret for how someone felt rather than for what you did. I let her finish watching her perform, and when the silence stretched out afterward, I simply said, "You're not sorry you hurt me? You're sorry I married someone you thought was worthless, who turned out to be worth $3 billion. My mother's mouth opened, ready to protest, but my father put a hand on her arm. "She's right, Margaret," he said quietly. "We're here under false pretenses, and Ashley can see right through us." It was possibly the most honest thing my father had ever said to me, and it shocked us all into silence. My mother looked at him like he'd betrayed some unspoken pact, but he kept his eyes on me. "We need help," he continued, his voice heavy. "We're in trouble, Ashley. Real trouble." I sat down then in the chair across from them because whatever was coming required me to be at eye level. "What kind of trouble?" The story came out in pieces. 6 months ago, my father had invested heavily in what he thought was a revolutionary real estate development opportunity. A former colleague, someone he'd trusted for 20 years, had brought him into an exclusive investment group. The returns were supposed to be extraordinary. The development was supposed to be guaranteed. It was a Ponzi scheme. Sophisticated, well disguised, but ultimately just a con that collapsed 3 weeks ago when the man running it disappeared with everyone's money. My father had mortgaged the house to increase his investment. He'd borrowed against his retirement accounts. He'd been so certain, so convinced, this was his chance to finally achieve the kind of wealth that would make him matter in the circles he'd always wanted to join. "We're facing foreclosure," he said flatly. "The bank gave us 90 days. That was 60 days ago." I looked at my mother, who'd gone very still and pale. She'd built her entire identity on that house, on her position in society, on the appearance of success. Losing it would destroy everything she'd constructed. "And Lily?" I asked. My mother's composure cracked slightly. "She can't find work. Every interview goes well until they do a background check. Being terminated for financial misconduct." She couldn't finish the sentence. "She's been living with us," my father added. "We can't even afford to help her with an apartment. When the house goes, I don't know where any of us will end up." I should have felt satisfaction. Some part of me had imagined this in my angriest moments. My family brought low, forced to understand what it felt like to be dismissed and devalued. But sitting there watching my father's shoulders slump and my mother fight back tears, I felt mostly tired. "So you came here to ask Mark to bail you out," I said. "We came to ask you," my mother said, and there was something raw in her voice now, the performance finally cracking. "We know we have no right. We know we treated you terribly, treated Mark terribly. We know we rejected you when you needed our support. But we're desperate, Ashley. We're about to lose everything." You already lost everything, I said quietly. You lost your daughter 2 months ago. The house and the money are just catching up to that fact. My mother flinched like I'd slapped her. I stood up, moved to the window, looked out at the street where normal people were going about their normal lives, untouched by this small family drama playing out in a modest apartment in Cleveland. You know what the worst part is? I said, not turning around. I actually understand. I understand being desperate. I understand making mistakes. I understand wanting help when everything's falling apart. I turned back to face them. But you taught me something important. You taught me that family helps family, unless that family member isn't impressive enough, isn't successful enough, isn't worthy enough of your standards. And you taught me to walk away from people who only see my value when they need something from me. Ashley, my father started. No, I said, and my voice was harder now. You don't get to Ashley me. You don't get to show up with expensive flowers and rehearsed apologies and expect me to forget that you called my wedding a circus, that you told me I was on my own, that you've spent my entire life making me feel like I was never quite good enough to deserve your love. The silence that followed was broken only by my mother's quiet crying. My father sat very still, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so soft I almost didn't hear it. We don't deserve your help, he said, but we're begging anyway. I told my parents I needed time to think, which was generous, considering they'd given me approximately 0 seconds to process their rejection of my wedding. They left with something between hope and defeat in their eyes, and I spent the next 2 days in a fog of complicated emotions. Mark listened patiently as I worked through it all out loud, trying to figure out what I owed them, if anything, and what kind of person I wanted to be in the face of their crisis. I don't want to help them because I'm afraid of being the bad daughter, I told Mark on the second evening. But I also don't want to refuse help just to punish them. That feels like letting their cruelty turn me cruel. So help them, Mark said simply, but on your terms, not theirs. We were still discussing the parameters of what that might look like when the letter arrived. Official Government Letterhead Department of Homeland Security, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. My hand shook as I opened it. Dear Ms. Reed, it began, and my stomach dropped before I even finished the first paragraph. We have received information suggesting irregularities in your citizenship documentation. You are hereby requested to provide proof of U.S. citizenship within 30 days by appearing at our Cleveland office with original birth certificate, passport, and any additional documentation supporting your citizenship claim. I read it 3 times, my heart pounding so hard I felt dizzy. I was born in Ohio. I'd never been out of the country except for one trip to Canada in college. My birth certificate was legitimate, filed at the Cleveland hospital where I'd been delivered 36 years ago. But the letter made it sound like I was under investigation, like someone had reported me for immigration fraud. Mark, I called out, my voice shaking. Mark, you need to see this. He came immediately, read the letter, and his face went dark in a way I'd never seen before. This is bullshit, he said flatly. Someone reported you. This doesn't just happen randomly. But who would... I stopped the answer, hitting me like ice water. My family. My desperate, panicking family, who'd just asked for help and been told to wait. Had they decided to apply pressure to force my hand by creating a crisis I'd need Mark's resources to solve? But Mark was already on his phone texting someone with rapid, angry keystrokes. I'm having this traced, he said. If someone filed a false report, there will be a record. And when I find out who did this, they're going to regret it. The next 3 days were a nightmare. Even though I knew I was a legitimate US citizen, even though I had all my documentation, the weight of a government investigation made me feel like a criminal. I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining scenarios where some bureaucratic error led to detention, deportation to a country I'd never lived in separation from Mark. I knew these fears were irrational, but fear doesn't care about rationality. Mark hired an immigration attorney immediately, someone who assured me this was almost certainly a nuisance complaint and would be resolved quickly. But she also warned me that even baseless investigations could take months to fully close. On the fourth day, Mark came home with an expression I couldn't read. Not anger exactly, something colder. "It was Lily," he said without preamble. "The tip came from an anonymous email, but my investigator traced the IP address. It came from your parents' house from a laptop registered to your sister." I sat down slowly on the couch trying to process this information. Lily reported me for immigration fraud. Mark handed me a printed email. The language was vicious, claiming I was a Canadian national, using false documents that I'd married Mark for a green card, that I was committing federal crimes and should be investigated immediately. It was detailed enough to trigger a response, but vague enough to avoid immediate disproof. "She sent it to 3 different media outlets and 2 government agencies," Mark said. "She wanted to destroy you publicly and legally." I stared at the email at my sister's words, designed to ruin my life, and felt something break inside me that I hadn't even known was still intact. Some small hope that my sister might actually care about me underneath all the competition and resentment. "I need to talk to her," I said. "Ashley, no, I need to hear her say it. I need to understand why." Mark didn't try to stop me. He just drove me to my parents' house, and we sat in the car for a moment before going in. "I'll be right beside you," he said. "And if I think she's going to hurt you more, we're leaving." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and we walked to the door together. My father answered, his face showing surprise and something that might have been guilt. "Ashley, we weren't expecting—" "Where's Lily?" I asked. "She's upstairs. Why?" I pushed past him, Mark following, and climbed the stairs to Lily's old bedroom, where she'd apparently been living since losing her job. I didn't knock. I opened the door to find her sitting on the bed with her laptop, and the guilt on her face when she saw me was all the confirmation I needed. "You reported me to immigration," I said, my voice shaking. "You tried to have me investigated for fraud." Lily's face crumpled. "Ashley, Don't lie to me," Mark said coldly from behind me. "We have the email. We traced the IP address. We know it was you." Lily looked between us trapped, and then something in her collapsed. She started crying, not the pretty tears she'd perfected for getting out of trouble, but ugly, desperate sobs. "I was jealous," she choked out. "You always got to be the victim, the one everyone felt sorry for. Mum and Dad pushed me so hard, had such high expectations, and I spent my whole life trying to be perfect for them. And you just got to opt out. You got to be ordinary and still have people love you for it. Even Mark." She looked at him with something close to hatred. "You could have had anyone, and you chose her. Perfect, ordinary Ashley, who never had to try." "I almost destroyed your sister's life," Mark said, his voice ice. "For what jealousy?" "Mum always loved you more," Lily said, looking at me through her tears. "She never said it, but I knew. You were the one she worried about, the one she thought about. I was just the performing seal doing tricks for approval. I thought, if you finally failed spectacularly, maybe she'd finally see me instead of just my achievements." "So you wanted to see me fail," I said slowly. "Just once, so badly that you were willing to risk my freedom, my marriage, my entire life." "I'm sorry," Lily whispered. "I'm so sorry, Ashley. I didn't think they'd actually investigate. I thought they'd just dismiss it." I looked at my sister, my younger sister, who I'd spent years envying, thinking she had everything I'd never been given, and I realised we'd both been casualties of the same parents, just wounded in different ways. She'd been crushed under the weight of expectations, while I'd been dismissed for not meeting them. Neither of us had been loved for who we actually were, but understanding didn't equal forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Lily broke down crying. "Mum always loved you more. I just wanted her to see you fail just once." After Lily's confession, I didn't speak to my family for a week. The immigration investigation was closed immediately once I provided evidence of the false complaint, and my attorney assured me that Lily could face charges for filing a fraudulent report if I chose to pursue it. I didn't. Watching her sob in that bedroom, seeing how thoroughly she'd been broken by the same system that had broken me, I found I didn't have the appetite for legal revenge, but I also wasn't ready to forgive or forget. Mark found me one evening staring at my phone at the accumulating messages from my mother begging for a chance to explain, to make things right, to see me. "You're going to drive yourself crazy if you keep avoiding this," he said gently. "I know," I admitted, "but I don't know what I want from them. An apology. Punishment, understanding, all of it feels inadequate." "What if we invited them to dinner?" Mark suggested. I looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Why would we do that?" "Because right now they're in limbo, and so are you. You need closure, Ashley. Not for them, for yourself. And I think there are things they need to hear, things they need to understand about what they did not just to you, but to others." There was something in his tone, something deliberate that made me study his face more carefully. "What are you planning?" "Just dinner," he said. "And the truth, all of it." So I sent the invitation. Simple, direct. "Dinner at our place, Saturday at 6. Just family." I didn't say which family would be there, didn't specify that this wasn't a reconciliation, but a reckoning. They arrived exactly on time, the three of them clustered together, like survivors of a shipwreck. My mother was dressed more simply than I'd ever seen her, and I realised with a shock that she'd probably sold most of her designer clothes. Lily looked thin and tired, dark circles under her eyes. My father's shoulders were permanently hunched now, like he was carrying weight he couldn't put down. Mark welcomed them with perfect courtesy, the kind that's indistinguishable from coldness, if you're paying attention. "Please come in. Dinner's almost ready." I watched my mother take in the apartment again, still modest, still ordinary, still confusing to someone who expected billionaires to live in penthouses and mansions. "This is a lovely space," she said, her voice strained with the effort of finding something appropriate to say. "Mark likes simplicity," I said. "He says most luxury is just insecurity dressed up as a success." My mother's smile flickered but held. Dinner was awkward in the way that significant meals often are, when everyone's performing civility over a foundation of unresolved hurt. Mark had cooked pasta with homemade sauce, simple salad bread he'd baked that afternoon, the kind of meal that showed care without showing off. Lily barely touched her food, pushing it around her plate while sneaking glances at me that I pretended not to see. My father ate mechanically, and my mother kept trying to make conversation that died in the heavy silence. "The pasta is delicious," she tried. "Did you study cooking as well as engineering?" "My mother taught me," Mark said. She believed that being able to feed yourself and others was a form of dignity, that depending on restaurants or others to meet basic needs was a kind of helplessness. It wasn't a direct insult, but we all heard the implication. My mother's face tightened. After we'd finished eating and I cleared the plates, refusing my mother's offer to help with a polite shake of my head, Mark stood up and left the room. He returned carrying an old wooden box, the kind that might have held tools or keepsakes. It was worn smooth with age and handling. He set it on the table and looked directly at my mother. "Do you remember this, Mrs. Reed?" My mother stared at the box, and I saw something flicker across her face. Not confusion, recognition, and fear. "I don't," she started. "Fall 2010, Mark said calmly. "Business Ethics 301. You were my professor. This is the box I kept my final project in, the one you gave back to me with a D marked in red across the cover." The room went completely still. My father looked confused, but Lily had gone white and my mother's hands were gripping the edge of the table. "You," she whispered, "you were that student, Mark Chen from my class. The one with unrealistic ideas about sustainable business." Mark said, his voice still calm, but with an edge now. The dreamer who didn't understand real-world economics. The naive kid who thought innovation could actually make a difference. He opened the box slowly. You wrote on my final evaluation that I'd never make it in the real world, that I lacked practical business sense, that my ideas were, and I quote, the fantasies of someone who will fail in any serious enterprise. He pulled out a paper yellowed with age, covered in red marks and harsh comments. My mother's handwriting was unmistakable. I kept it, Mark said. Not out of bitterness, but as a reminder of what happens when people with power use it to crush others, of what teachers can do to students who dare to think differently. My father was staring at my mother now, something like comprehension dawning. Margaret, what did you do? I was trying to help him, my mother said, but her voice was weak. He needed to understand the realities of business, not chase impossible dreams. You weren't trying to help him, I said, finding my voice. You were trying to make him as small and scared as you were. Mark wasn't finished. He reached into the box again and pulled out another document. This one was on official university letterhead. Inside was documentation with her handwriting and proof of something far worse than a bad grade. The document Mark pulled from the box was official formal, printed on university letterhead that had yellowed slightly with age, but remained unmistakably authentic. He placed it on the table between the dinner plates, positioning it so my mother could see it clearly. This is a letter you wrote to the Graduate Scholarship Committee, Mark said, his voice still controlled, but harder now. November 2010. I obtained it through a Freedom of Information Act request last year after I realised who Ashley's mother was and started to wonder if you'd done to her what you'd done to me. My mother's face had gone pale, but she lifted her chin in that defensive way I knew so well. I don't remember every letter I wrote 15 years ago. I was trying to provide honest assessments. Read it, Mark interrupted, pushing the letter closer to her, out loud, so your family can hear your honest assessment. My mother's hands trembled as she picked up the paper. For a long moment, she just stared at it, and I thought she might refuse. But something in Mark's expression, or maybe in mine, made her begin reading, her voice barely above a whisper. To the Graduate Scholarship Committee, I am writing regarding the application of Mark Chen for the Sustainable Innovation Fellowship. While Mr. Chen demonstrates enthusiasm for his subject matter, I cannot, in good conscience, recommend him for this prestigious award. His ideas, while creative, lack practical grounding in real-world business principles. He has repeatedly shown an inability to understand market forces and economic realities. His idealism, while perhaps admirable in theory, suggests a fundamental unsuitability for serious entrepreneurial work. He lacks the discipline and pragmatic thinking required for real-world success. I recommend the committee consider candidates with more realistic prospects and stronger business acumen. Sincerely, Professor Margaret Reed. The silence after she finished was absolute. Even the ambient sounds of the apartment seemed to have stopped, as if the world itself was holding its breath. You destroyed my scholarship application, Mark said quietly, the one I needed to continue my graduate research, the one that would have funded the early work that eventually became Chen Technologies. You decided I wasn't worthy, that my dreams were too unrealistic, that I should be stopped before I wasted anyone's time or money. I was protecting the program's reputation, my mother said, but her voice was hollow. I was trying to ensure resources went to students who would actually succeed. I built a company worth $3 billion, Mark said, and now there was real anger in his voice. I created technology that's being used in sustainable energy projects around the world. I employed thousands of people. I proved every assumption you made about me was wrong. So, forgive me if I don't believe you were protecting anyone except your own narrow view of what success looks like. My father had gone very still beside my mother, staring at her like he was seeing a stranger. Margaret, you told me you barely remembered having him as a student. You said it was just one semester, just one class. It was, my mother insisted. I taught hundreds of students. How was I supposed to know? But you do remember now, I said, my voice cutting through her protest. You remembered him the moment you saw his face on TV. You remembered what you had done to him. My mother opened her mouth to respond, but Mark had already reached back into the box. He pulled out another document, and I felt my stomach drop even before I saw what it was. And now we come to the interesting part, Mark said, his eyes fixed on my mother. Because while I was filing that FOIA request for my own records, I decided to search for anything related to the Reed family. And I found something else you wrote that same year, fall 2010. He placed the second letter on the table, and I recognised it immediately, even though I'd never actually seen it. It was the letter. The one declining my interior design scholarship, the one with my forged signature. This is a letter to Parsons School of Design, Mark continued. Declining a scholarship offer on behalf of your daughter, Ashley Reed, who was 17 at the time. A daughter who never saw this letter, never signed it, and never knew her mother had stolen her future, sir, until she found a photocopy of the offer months ago. Lily gasped. My father's face had gone from pale to grey, but my mother just sat there staring at the two letters side by side on the table. 2 dreams destroyed, 2 futures stolen, all in her handwriting. You forged my signature, I said, and my voice was shaking now. You told me you'd handle the paperwork. You told me the school had changed their mind, that they'd decided I wasn't ready. You let me believe for 18 years that I wasn't good enough, that I'd failed somehow. And all along, you just decided for me that I wasn't allowed to go. You were too young, my mother said, but she was crying now, tears streaming down her face. You would have been alone in New York, away from family, vulnerable. I would have been free, I said. I would have been pursuing my dream. I would have been becoming who I was meant to be, instead of spending 18 years trying to be small enough to earn your approval. Mark's voice cut through the emotion, cold and precise. And when Ashley applied for that design scholarship the same year, fall 2010, you sent a rejection letter with her forged signature. You used university letterhead, even though you had no authority over Parsons' admissions. You impersonated your own daughter to destroy her future, just like you had destroyed mine. I filed a Freedom of Information request. These are all public university records now. He pulled out one more document, this one, with official stamps and dates. This is the original rejection letter with what claims to be Ashley's signature. I had a forensic document examiner compare it to Ashley's actual signature from that time period. It's not a match. It's your handwriting, Mrs. Reed, slightly modified to look younger. You committed fraud, you committed forgery, and you did it to your own daughter. My father stood abruptly, his chest scraping against the floor. He was looking at my mother like he'd never seen her before. Margaret, what have you done? What have you done? My mother was sobbing now, her carefully maintained composure shattered completely. I couldn't lose her. I couldn't lose both of you. Your father was always working. You girls were all I had, and Ashley was going to leave me behind. So you made sure she couldn't, Mark finished. You crushed her dreams to keep her close, just like you crushed mine because they didn't fit your narrow definition of what was possible. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking. I looked at my mother, this woman who'd spent my entire life making me feel insufficient, making me doubt myself, making me believe I was too ordinary to deserve extraordinary things. And I realised she'd done it all deliberately, not out of some misguided concern for my well-being, but out of her own fear and need for control. My mother's face turned white as snow. For the first time in her life, she had no script to follow. That night after my family left, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Mark slept peacefully beside me and tried to understand what I was feeling. I'd wanted this confrontation, needed it even. I'd wanted my mother to face what she'd done, to see herself clearly for once, instead of through the distorted lens of her own justifications. but now that it had happened, I felt strangely empty, like I'd been carrying anger for so long that, without it, I didn't know what to hold on to. "You're awake," Mark murmured beside me, not opening his eyes. "Did you know this would happen?" I asked. "When you planned the dinner, did you know it would feel like this?" "Like what?" "Like winning and losing at the same time." He rolled over to face me, his eyes open now in the darkness. "Closure isn't the same as satisfaction. You got the truth out in the open, that's what you needed. What you do with it now, that's up to you." I thought we'd have time to figure that out privately, within the bounds of our family. I was wrong. The story broke 2 days later. A journalist who'd been following Mark's return to public life published a long-form piece about his disappearance from the tech world. Buried in the article was a section about his educational background, including his experience with a professor who'd actively tried to destroy his scholarship opportunities. Mark had given the journalist permission to use the documents to tell his story as a case study in how academic gatekeepers could crush innovation. The article didn't name my mother initially, but it included enough details: the university, the time frame, the specific scholarship that it took less than 6 hours for someone to identify her. And once her name was out there, everything else followed. Within 48 hours, the story had gone viral. Not just the tech blogs, but mainstream news outlets, education journals, even some national morning shows. Professor's crusade against her own daughter became a headline I couldn't escape. The forged signature, the stolen scholarship, the pattern of crushing students she deemed unworthy, it was all laid out for public consumption. And once the door opened, others walked through it. Former students started coming forward with their own stories. A woman who'd been told her business plan for a women's co-working space was too niche and emotional to succeed. That space now had 12 locations across 3 states. A man who'd been failed in my mother's class for proposing a sustainable packaging company. He'd sold that company to a major corporation for $40 million 2 years ago. A student who'd been told she'd never make it in business because she lacked the ruthlessness required. She was now the CEO of a non-profit that had helped thousands of families escape poverty. The pattern was clear and damning. My mother hadn't just been a tough professor. She'd been systematically crushing anyone whose vision didn't match her narrow, fearful view of what was possible or acceptable. She'd wielded her small amount of academic power like a weapon, cutting down dreams because she'd never had the courage to pursue her own. By the end of the week, the story had reached my mother's social circles. The Lakeside Women's Society, the organisation she'd dedicated 20 years to the source of her identity and social status. They called an emergency board meeting. I learnt about it from Rebecca, who heard it from her neighbour, who was on the board. They'd voted unanimously to remove my mother from their membership list. The official letter, which someone leaked to the press, was brief and devastating. The Lakeside Women's Society was founded on principles of supporting and uplifting women in our community. We cannot, in good conscience, maintain an association with someone who has demonstrably used her position to crush the aspirations of young people, including her own daughter. We don't associate with those who diminish others to feel tall. My mother's entire social infrastructure collapsed within a week. Invitations were rescinded. Charity boards asked her to step down. Friends stopped returning her calls. She'd built her identity on being respected and admired in certain circles, and those circles had closed their doors completely. Then the internet found Lily. Her attempt to frame me for immigration fraud had been documented in my attorney's response to ICE, and someone had filed a FOIA request for those records too. The details went viral on social media. The jealous sister who tried to destroy her sibling's life, who'd filed false government reports out of spite. The attacks online were vicious. Lily's social media accounts were flooded with comments calling her toxic, jealous, a cautionary tale about sibling rivalry gone wrong. Her employment situation, already dire, became impossible. Every potential employer who Googled her name now found page after page of articles about her sabotage attempt. After 5 days of sustained online harassment, Lily posted a video apology. I watched it once, and once was enough. She sat in what looked like her childhood bedroom, her face blotchy from crying, and admitted everything. The jealousy, the immigration fraud report, the years of resenting me while pretending to be the perfect daughter. "I'm sorry," she said to the camera, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry to my sister, who only ever tried to love me. I'm sorry to everyone I hurt. I was raised to believe that someone else's success meant my failure, that there wasn't enough love or approval to go around. I know that's not an excuse. I know I need to be better. I just want Ashley to know that I'm sorry." The video went viral, but not in the way Lily had hoped. It became a meme, a punchline, a symbol of everything people hated about entitled, jealous siblings. Reaction videos dissected every facial expression, every word choice, looking for signs of insincerity. Think pieces analysed her as a product of toxic parenting and competitive perfectionism. She'd wanted redemption, but got public dissection instead. I watched all of this unfold from a distance, like I was observing someone else's family drama. Mark would show me the headlines, the social media posts, the endless commentary on my family's public dismantling. People I'd never met had strong opinions about my mother's cruelty, my sister's jealousy, my own choice to expose them. "How does it feel?" Mark asked one evening after showing me an article about my mother being dropped from yet another organisation. I thought about it carefully. Revenge didn't need my hand. Karma had already begun its work, but I feel no joy, only emptiness. The emptiness I felt watching my family's public unravelling wasn't what I'd expected. I'd imagined that seeing them face consequences would bring some sense of justice, of balance restored. Instead, it just felt like watching a building collapse in slow motion, destructive and sad, and impossible to stop once it started. Mark had been supportive but distant those 2 weeks, giving me space to process while he spent long hours in his home office. I assumed he was dealing with the business fallout from his return to public life, fielding calls from investors and former colleagues who suddenly wanted back in his orbit. I should have known him better than that. I found out what he was really doing on a Thursday evening. I'd come home from a client meeting to find him at the dining table, surrounded by financial documents and legal papers, his laptop open to what looked like corporate acquisition reports. His expression was focused in a way I hadn't seen before, hard and calculating. "What's all this?" I asked, setting down my bag. He looked up and something in his eyes made me uneasy. "I'm looking at Anderson & Lloyd, your father's firm." I felt my stomach tighten. "Why?" "Because they're failing." He turned the laptop towards me, showing spreadsheets with numbers trending steadily downward. "They've been mismanaged for years, taking on debt they can't service, losing clients to more innovative competitors. They're maybe 6 months from bankruptcy, probably less." "Okay," I said slowly. "But why are you looking at them?" Mark leaned back in his chair and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before, something cold and angry and dangerous. "Because I could buy them. I have the capital. I could acquire the company, restructure it, and your father would be laid off in the downsizing, legally as part of standard business practice. No one could call it revenge. It would just be smart business, cutting dead weight during reorganization." The words hit me like ice water. "Mark, he stood by and watched while your mother destroyed you." Mark continued, his voice tight with controlled fury. "He sat silent at that dinner table when she called your wedding a circus. He knew what she was doing to you your whole life, and he did nothing because it was easier to look away than to stand up to her. And now, I randomly have the power to make him feel what that powerlessness is like. To take away his livelihood, his dignity, his sense of purpose. The same things your mother took from you." I sat down across from him, my hands shaking slightly. I'd never seen Mark like this, never heard him talk about deliberately hurting someone. Even when he'd exposed my mother at dinner, it had been about truth, not cruelty. "You've been planning this," I said. "For how long?" "Since the dinner," he admitted. "Since I watched your mother's face and realised that exposure wasn't enough. They're sorry now because they got caught, because there were consequences. But they're not actually sorry for what they did to you. Your father sent those emails apologizing, but has he offered to do anything? Has he stood up to your mother? Has he taken any real responsibility? No, I said quietly. But Mark, this isn't you. This isn't who you are. Maybe it should be, he said, and there was real pain in his voice now. I've spent 5 years trying to be better than the people who betrayed me, trying to prove that choosing integrity over revenge made me somehow superior. But where did that get me? I was fixing toilets while they lived in mansions. Your mother crushed students for decades and got to be respected in her community. Your father enabled abuse for years and got to feel comfortable in his cowardice. Where's the justice in that? I understood the anger. God, I understood it. I'd felt it myself, lying awake at night, imagining all the ways I could make my family hurt the way they'd hurt me. But looking at Mark now, seeing how the anger had twisted something essential in him, I realised that revenge had a cost that went beyond its target. I reached across the table and took his hands. They were tense, almost trembling with suppressed rage. If we become them, what did we really win? I said softly. I didn't marry you to watch you lose yourself in revenge. I married you because you showed me there was another way to live with integrity, with authenticity, with the courage to be kind even when the world gave you every reason not to be. They don't deserve kindness, Mark said, but I heard the waver in his voice, the doubt creeping in. No, they don't, I agreed, but we deserve to be people who can choose kindness anyway. Not because they've earned it, but because we want to be able to look at ourselves and recognise who we see. Mark closed his eyes and I watched the tension slowly drain from his shoulders. When he opened them again, they were wet with unshed tears. I wanted to hurt them, he whispered. I wanted them to feel what it's like to have everything taken away by someone more powerful. I wanted them to be helpless and desperate and scared. I know, I said. I wanted that too, and watching it happen to them through public exposure should have felt good, but it didn't. It just felt empty. Because their suffering doesn't actually heal what they broke in us. It just creates more brokenness. Mark pulled his hands free and started closing the laptop, gathering the documents into a pile. You're right, he said quietly. You're right, and I knew you would be, but I needed to hear you say it. I needed you to save me from becoming the person I hated most. He stood up and pulled me into his arms, holding me so tight I could barely breathe. I'm sorry, he murmured into my hair. I'm sorry I almost let the anger win. We're both angry, I said. That's not going to go away just because we choose not to act on it, but maybe we can figure out what to do with it that doesn't destroy us in the process. Mark stepped back and wiped his eyes. So what do we do? Just let them suffer through their own consequences and stay out of it. I thought about it carefully. My family was facing bankruptcy, social exile, public humiliation. My mother had lost everything she'd built her identity on. Lily couldn't find work and was living in a childhood bedroom drowning in online harassment. My father was watching his marriage and his comfortable life disintegrate around him. I could let them drown. I could stand on the shore and watch without offering a hand. That would be justice in a way. Natural consequences for decades of cruelty and neglect. Or I could offer them something different. Not rescue, I wasn't going to save them from their own choices. But maybe a lifeline, a chance to save themselves if they could find the courage to actually change. I think we give them a chance, I said slowly. Not to go back to who they were, but to become something better. We set boundaries, we're honest about what they did, but we don't actively destroy them. We let them either rise to the occasion or fail on their own merits. Mark studied my face for a long moment. You're sure, after everything? No, I admitted, but I'm sure that I don't want revenge to define us. I'd rather try forgiveness, even if it fails, than succeed at becoming people we can't respect. Mark nodded slowly, then sat back down at the computer and opened his email. I watched as he typed a message to his acquisition team. Cancel the Anderson & Lloyd due diligence. We're not proceeding with the purchase. He hit send and exhaled deeply. You saved me again. I almost became the person I hated most. We decided that evening to offer my family one chance. Not money, not rescue, but an opportunity to rebuild, with their own hands if they chose to. We would set clear boundaries, demand real accountability, but we wouldn't use our power to crush them the way they'd once crushed others. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And my mother had one more truth to face. My father's voice on the phone had been quiet and defeated when he called. We're moving out in 2 weeks before the bank takes the house. I thought you might want to come get your things, old photos, school projects, whatever you want to keep. Your mother is at her sister's for the afternoon. It might be easier if you came while she's not here. I agreed, more out of a desire for closure than any real attachment to childhood belongings. Mark offered to come with me, but I told him I needed to do this alone. Some ghosts you have to face by yourself. The house looks smaller than I remembered, or maybe I'd just grown larger. The for sale sign was gone, replaced by a notice of foreclosure taped to the front door. The garden my mother had meticulously maintained was overgrown, the lawn patchy. Even the house itself seemed diminished, like it had given up trying to impress anyone. My father let me in without much ceremony. He looked older, greyer, hollowed out. Most of your things are in the attic, he said. Boxes labelled with your name. Take whatever you want. Take all of it if you'd like. Where are you moving? I asked. A rental apartment across town. 2 bedrooms, your mother and I in one, Lily in the other. He smiled without humour. It'll be cosy. He left me alone after that, retreating to his study to continue packing. I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, a space I'd rarely visited even as a child. It smelled of dust and old paper and time. My boxes were easy to find labelled in my mother's precise handwriting. I opened them one by one, school artwork, participation trophies, yearbooks, filled with signatures from people I no longer remembered. The archaeology of a childhood spent trying to be seen. I was about to leave when I noticed another box tucked in the corner, partially hidden behind old Christmas decorations. It wasn't labelled, just a plain cardboard box, sealed with aging tape. Something made me open it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, maybe more, all in envelopes that had been addressed but never sent, stamps affixed but never mailed, all addressed to me. With shaking hands, I pulled out the first one. The postmark date was from 18 years ago, right around the time I'd received the scholarship offer. The envelope had been opened and resealed multiple times, the paper soft with handling. I unfolded the letter and began to read. My dearest Ashley, it began in my mother's handwriting. You received the scholarship letter today. I watched your face light up as you read it, watched you start planning your escape from this small life I've built. And I know I should be happy for you. A good mother would be happy. But all I can think is, if you leave for that scholarship, you'll forget where you came from. You'll forget me. You'll become someone I don't recognise, living a life I can't understand, and I'll be alone. I know I should let you go. I know I should want what's best for you. But what if what's best for you means losing you forever? I'm not strong enough for that. I'm not good enough to let you fly away. So tomorrow I'll tell you I'll handle the paperwork, and I'll make sure you stay. Forgive me. Or don't. But please, please don't leave me. I sat down hard on the dusty attic floor, the letter trembling in my hands. I reached for another envelope, this one from 11 years ago, around the time I'd moved out to my own apartment. Ashley, I called you today to see if you wanted to come to dinner Sunday. You said you were busy. You're always busy now. Busy with your own life, your own friends, your own world that doesn't include me. I wonder if this is how my mother felt when I left her behind. She lived alone in that small house until she died, and I visited once a month out of obligation, not love. She must have known. She must have felt how far away I'd gone even when I was sitting right next to her. Is that what I've become to you? The obligation you fulfill because you're supposed to, Not because you want to, I suppose I deserve it. I pushed you away so successfully that now you've actually gone. The pattern in the letters was devastating and clear. Year after year of unsent words, my mother writing out her fears and regrets in private while presenting her cold, critical face to me in person. Letters apologising for things she'd never apologised for out loud. Letters recognising her own cruelty while being unable to stop perpetuating it. Letters revealing a woman trapped by her own fear and pride, watching her daughter slip away and not knowing how to stop it without admitting she'd been wrong. The final letter was dated just over a year ago, shortly before I met Mark. I almost didn't want to open it, but I needed to see how this story ended. I saw you today, Ashley. You didn't see me. You were at the grocery store laughing with someone I didn't recognise, looking so light and free. And I realised something standing there in the produce aisle watching my daughter, who doesn't want to be my daughter anymore. You look happy without me. Actually, happy, not the careful, guarded version of happiness you showed when you'd visit for holidays. You've built a life that doesn't need me or my approval, and that should make me angry or hurt. But mostly I'm just glad. I'm glad you escaped. I'm glad you became someone despite my best efforts to keep you small. I'm glad that my failures as a mother didn't completely destroy you. I should tell you this. I should call you and say I'm sorry and I'm proud and I see you now in ways I refused to see you before. But I'm a coward. I'm a coward who sabotaged her own daughter out of fear and called it love. So instead, I'll write this letter I'll never send and hope that somehow you'll know. You deserved better than me. You deserved a mother who could celebrate your light instead of trying to dim it. I'm terribly, terribly sorry. I sat in the attic for over an hour, reading and rereading the letters, watching my mother's emotional journey play out in words she'd never had the courage to speak. She'd known what she was doing. She'd known it was wrong. She'd hated herself for it, but hadn't been strong enough to change. The cruelty hadn't been mindless or casual. It had been deliberate, yes, but born from a wound I was only now beginning to understand. My mother's mother had been cold and distant, and my mother had spent her childhood starving for affection that never came. When she'd finally escaped to build her own family, she'd been determined not to lose her children, the way she'd lost her mother, not recognising that her methods guaranteed the very abandonment she feared. She didn't destroy my dream out of cruelty. She did it because she couldn't bear to be left behind just like her own mother left her. I stayed in that attic, sitting among the dust and unsent apologies, until I heard the front door open and my mother's voice calling to my father. I heard the murmur of his response, heard him tell her I was here. Then silence, the kind that comes when someone is gathering courage to face something they've been dreading. I gathered the letters carefully, stacking them back in their box, and carried them down the narrow attic stairs. My mother was standing in the foyer when I descended, frozen, halfway between entering the house and fleeing from it. She looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with the designer clothes she'd sold or the expensive jewellery that was gone. She looked like someone who'd been stripped down to her essential self and found it wanting. "Ashley," she said, and my name in her mouth sounded like an apology and a question at once. I held up the box. "I found these." Her face went through several emotions at once: recognition, shame, fear. "You weren't supposed to see those." "I know," I said. "That's why you never sent them. But I found them anyway, and now I need to understand something." I moved past her into the living room, the formal space where we'd had so many stiff, uncomfortable family gatherings. I sat on the sofa that would soon belong to someone else, and after a moment's hesitation, my mother sat across from me. I pulled out the oldest letter, the one from 18 years ago, and held it so she could see her own handwriting. "Why did you need me small to love me?" My mother's hands twisted in her lap, and I watched her face crumble in a way I'd never witnessed. She'd always been so controlled, so careful with her expressions, using them like tools to maintain her authority. But now there was no pretense, no performance, just raw pain. Because I didn't know how to love anything I couldn't control, she said, her voice breaking, because love for me always meant fear. Fear of losing, fear of being abandoned, fear of not being enough to make someone stay. But I'm your daughter, I said. I wasn't going to abandon you. I just wanted to live my own life. I know that now, she whispered. I think I knew it then too. But knowing something intellectually and believing it emotionally are different things. My mother... She stopped, pressed her lips together as if physically holding back words she'd never spoken out loud. Tell me, I said quietly. I need to understand. She took a shuddering breath. My mother was brilliant. She could have been anything. A professor, a writer, a scientist. She had this incredible mind that could see patterns and connections other people missed. But she was born in 1935, and brilliant women in small Ohio towns in the 50s didn't get many chances. She married my father because it was what you did, had me because it was what was expected, and spent 30 years watching her life narrow down to nothing. My mother looked at me, and I saw tears streaming down her face, but she kept talking. She resented me. Not consciously, maybe, but I felt it every day, this cold distance, like I was the reason her dreams had died. When I was 17, I got into Wellesley. Full scholarship. It was my chance to escape, to become someone. And she said no. She said I was needed at home, that education was wasted on someone who'd just get married anyway, that I was being selfish and ungrateful. So I stayed. I went to community college. I married your father. I had you and Lily, and I became her, a woman watching her life narrow down to nothing. So you did to me what she did to you, I said, and it wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Yes, my mother said, and I hated myself for it even while I was doing it, because I could see that you had everything I'd wanted: talent, dreams, courage. You were going to leave and become something magnificent, and I couldn't bear it. Not because I didn't want you to succeed, but because if you succeeded, it meant I had wasted my entire life being safe. It meant I'd chosen wrong, that my fear had cost me everything, that I could have been brave, but wasn't. She was sobbing now, her careful composure completely shattered. I couldn't bear watching you become everything I was too afraid to be. Every time you showed me your designs, every time you talked about your dreams, I saw my own failures reflected back at me. So I made you smaller. I made you doubt yourself. I stole your opportunities and told myself it was for your own good. But really, I was just trying to make sure I wasn't alone in my cage. I set the letters down carefully on the coffee table between us. Did you ever think about just telling me this? About being honest about your fears instead of expressing them as cruelty? Every day, she said. Every single day. But I was so ashamed. How do you tell your daughter that you're jealous of her, that you're terrified of her succeeding, that you love her but also resent her for having chances you never had? What kind of mother feels that way? A human one, I said quietly. A wounded one. A person who never got help for her own pain and ended up passing it on to the next generation. My mother looked at me through her tears, something like hope flickering in her eyes. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I want you to. What I did to you, what I did to Mark, to all those students, there's no excuse for it. But I need you to know that I see it now. I see what I did and why I did it. And I see that you became extraordinary despite me, not because of me. And I'm proud of you. I'm so desperately proud of you, and I'm sorry I never learnt how to say that until it was too late. I sat there looking at this woman who'd caused me so much pain, who'd stolen my opportunities and crushed my confidence, who'd made me believe I was ordinary when I wasn't. And for the first time, I didn't just see my oppressor. I saw a frightened girl who'd never gotten to leave that small Ohio town, who'd spent 50 years trapped in a life she didn't choose, who'd been so consumed by her own unfulfilled dreams that she couldn't celebrate mine. It didn't excuse what she'd done, Understanding doesn't equal absolution, but it added context, complexity, humanity to a story I'd been telling myself in simple terms of villain and victim. I stood up slowly and crossed the small distance between us. My mother looked up at me with something like fear, like she expected me to leave now that I'd heard her confession. Instead, I sat beside her on the couch and opened my arms. She collapsed into them, sobbing like a child, and I held her while she cried. Not because she deserved comfort, but because we both needed to acknowledge that the person who'd hurt me was also a person who'd been hurt, that cycles of pain don't have simple origins or easy resolutions. "I'm not ready to forgive you completely," I said into her hair. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget what you did, but I'm willing to try to understand. I'm willing to see you as more than just the person who hurt me." My mother pulled back slightly, wiping her eyes. "That's more than I deserve." "Maybe," I said, "but it's what I'm offering, not for you, for me. Because I don't want to carry this anger forever. I don't want to become bitter and small because of what was done to me. I want to be bigger than that." We sat there for a long time, not speaking, just existing in the same space without the usual walls between us. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the windows of the house that was no longer really theirs. For the first time, I saw her not as my villain, but as a frightened woman who had been fighting her own demons all along. 3 months after that conversation, in the nearly empty house, I drove past my childhood home and saw what I'd been expecting, a sold sign with a red banner across it. The house had sold quickly despite the scandal. Apparently someone saw value in the bones of the place, even if they didn't know its history of broken dreams and stolen futures. I pulled over and sat there for a moment, looking at the house that had loomed so large in my memories. It looked smaller now, ordinary, just a building where a family had lived and hurt each other in the ways families sometimes do. Soon, it would house different people, different stories, different kinds of damage or healing. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. "Moving day tomorrow. New address attached. You're welcome to visit if you'd like." The new address was for a rental house in a neighbourhood 20 minutes away, the kind of place where young families start out and retirees downsize to. A neighbourhood of people rebuilding, starting over, making do. My family would fit right in. Mark and I had discussed extensively what we would and wouldn't do. He'd wanted to pay off their debts entirely, give them a clean slate, but I'd disagreed. Clean slates, I'd argued, don't teach anything. They just reset the game board without changing how people play. They need to feel this, I'd said, not as punishment, but as consequence. They need to understand that actions have weight, that the way you treat people matters, that you can't just apologise and have everything go back to how it was. "So what do we do?" Mark had asked. "We give them what they never gave me a chance to prove themselves, but we make them work for it." The first test came 2 weeks after they'd moved into the rental house. Lily had sent me an email, formal and stiff, with an attached resume. The email itself was brief. "I know I don't deserve to ask, but I'm attaching my resume in case you know of anyone hiring. I've applied to 47 positions in 3 months. No one will even interview me." I looked at her resume, impressive on paper if you didn't know the story behind the employment gap and the termination for misconduct. She had skills, she had experience. What she didn't have was a second chance from anyone willing to look past the first page of Google results. I'd called her instead of emailing back. The phone rang 4 times before she answered, her voice cautious. "Ashley, I have a position available," I'd said without preamble, entry-level assistant in my design firm. "It's mostly administrative, scheduling client communications, managing supplies, helping with research. The pay is $35,000 a year. Standard benefits. You'd be working directly under me." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Ashley, I can't work for you. It would be too humiliating." "Then I guess you're not desperate enough yet," I'd said, and I'd meant it kindly, though I knew it wouldn't sound that way. "This is the only offer I'm making, Lily. You can take it or not, but this is what I'm willing to give you. A real job with real responsibilities where you earn a real paycheck, not charity, not family obligation, work. Another long silence. Then, in a small voice, when would I start? Now 2 months into her employment, Lily showed up every morning at 8 sharp. She answered phones with careful professionalism. She organised my sample materials with precision that surprised me. She stayed late when projects demanded it without complaint or expectation of praise. She was, I had to admit, good at the work, better than I'd expected. And, more importantly, she was humble in a way she'd never been before. She didn't make excuses. She didn't expect special treatment. She just did the work. We'd had only one conversation about what she'd done to me. It was her 3rd week, and she'd stayed late to help me prepare materials for a presentation. As we were packing up, she'd said quietly, "Thank you for giving me this chance." "Don't thank me yet," I'd replied. "You'll start at the bottom and earn every promotion. If you want to move up, you'll do it because you've proven yourself, not because you're my sister." "I understand," she'd said. Then, after a pause, "I'm sorry for what I did, for trying to destroy you. I know saying it doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know I'm sorry." "I know you are," I'd said. "Now show me with your actions, not your words." My parents had been harder to help because what they needed wasn't a job, but a complete restructuring of how they understood themselves. My father, laid off in the company restructuring, had found part-time work doing financial consulting for small businesses. It paid a fraction of what he'd made before, and he worked from a spare bedroom instead of a corner office, but it was honest work. My mother had taken longer to figure out. She couldn't go back to teaching, no school would hire her after the scandal. Her social circles had evaporated. She was a woman in her late 50s with no career, no status, and no clear path forward. It was Mark who suggested she volunteer at the library. "She loves books," he'd said. "She loves organising things, creating order. Maybe she could find purpose in that." I'd pass along the suggestion during one of our careful, tentative phone calls. My mother had been silent for a long moment, then said, "I could try that." 3 months in, she was there 4 days a week, shelving books and helping patrons. She'd even started a reading program for kids whose parents couldn't afford daycare, sitting with them after school reading aloud, helping with homework. She did it for free for the simple satisfaction of being useful. "She's good with the children," the library director had told me when I'd stopped by to see it for myself. Patient in a way you don't always see, like she's trying to give them something she wishes someone had given her. The final conversation about money and help happened on a Sunday afternoon. I'd invited my parents to dinner at our place. Not a test this time, just dinner. Lily came too, still cautious around me, but less afraid. After we'd eaten and cleaned up, my father cleared his throat in that way that meant he had something difficult to say. "Ashley, we wanted to ask. We know we're not in a position to ask anything, but we wondered if you might consider—" "No," I said gently but firmly. "I won't give you money to restore your old life. I won't pay off your debts or buy you a house or fund the lifestyle you had before. That life was built on looking down on others, on measuring worth by net worth, on crushing people who didn't fit your narrow definition of success. I won't help you build that again." My mother's face crumpled slightly, but she nodded. "We understand. But," I continued, "I'll give you what you never gave me. I'll give you a chance to rebuild with your own hands and your own dignity. I'll give you the opportunity to discover who you are when you're not performing for an audience. I'll give you space to become people you can actually respect instead of people pretending to be respectable." My father looked at his hands. "That's harder than getting money." "I know," I said. "That's the point. You wanted my wealth. I'm giving you something much harder, the opportunity to earn your own respect." The anger was quieter now, but it was still there. 6 Months of watching my family rebuild their lives from the ground up should have brought me some sense of closure. But instead, I found myself caught in a strange limbo, not quite angry enough to cut them off completely, but not quite healed enough to fully let go. Mark noticed before I did. We were having dinner at home on a random Thursday evening when he set down his fork and looked at me with that careful expression that meant he'd been thinking about something for a while. "You're still carrying it," he said gently. "Carrying what? The weight of what they did. You've forgiven them enough to help them, but you haven't forgiven them enough to free yourself." I wanted to argue, but he was right. I could feel it in the way my stomach tightened every time Lily walked into my office, the way I found myself mentally cataloguing my mother's volunteer work as if keeping score of her redemption, the way I measured every interaction with my family against some invisible standard of whether they'd changed enough, suffered enough, understood enough. "I don't know how to let it go," I admitted. "Part of me thinks I shouldn't have to, that they should carry the weight of what they did, not me." "They are carrying it," Mark said, "but so are you. And I think you're carrying it because some part of you believes that if you stop being angry, it means what they did was okay. That forgiveness equals permission." "Doesn't it?" "No," he said firmly. "Forgiveness means you're no longer willing to let their actions determine your present. It means you're choosing to live in the life you have now instead of the life they stole from you 18 years ago." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mark's words about the difference between holding people accountable and holding on to resentment, about the space between justice and vengeance, between boundaries and bitterness. I got up quietly, careful not to wake Mark, and went to the living room where we'd hung our wedding photo. It was the candid shot from that photographer-journalist the moment right after we'd been pronounced husband and wife. My face was radiant, completely unself-conscious, lit up with pure joy. Mark was looking at me like I was the only person in the world. I stared at that photo for a long time at the woman I'd been that day, free and certain and present. And I realised I hadn't felt that way since. Not completely. Because even in my happiest moments, there was a part of me that was still back in that childhood home, still trying to be good enough, still seeking approval from people who'd never learned how to give it freely. "I spent so many years wanting them to see me," I said out loud, even though I was alone. "I forgot to see myself." "You're seeing yourself now," Mark said from the doorway. I hadn't heard him get up, but there he was, rumpled and sleepy, and watching me with those eyes that always saw through to the truth. "Am I?" I asked, because I still feel like I'm performing. Even now, with them watching from a distance, I'm still trying to prove something, that I'm successful enough, happy enough, healed enough. Like I need them to witness my happiness and regret what they missed. Mark crossed the room and wrapped his arms around me from behind both of us, looking at the wedding photo. True victory isn't making them regret what they did. It's living so well that their opinion no longer defines you. "I don't know if I know how to do that," I whispered. "Their opinion has defined me my entire life. When they thought I was ordinary, I felt ordinary. When they dismissed my dreams, I doubted them. Even now, when they can see I was right to choose you and choose my own path, I'm still looking to them for validation. How do I stop doing that?" "You decide," Mark said simply. "You decide that you're done letting them be the measure of your worth. You decide that what you think of yourself matters more than what they think of you. You decide to close that chapter, not with cruelty, not with a grand confrontation, but just by turning the page and starting a new story where they're supporting characters instead of the main plot." I leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "I think I need to see my mother one last time, not to confront her or make her understand anything, just to close something, to say goodbye to who we were to each other, and accept that we might never be more than what we are now." "Then do that," Mark said. "Do it for yourself, not for her." The next morning, I called my mother and asked if we could meet for coffee. Just the two of us, no agenda, no heavy conversations required. She agreed with a kind of careful hope in her voice that made me both sad and oddly peaceful. We met at a small cafe near her rental house, Neutral Territory. She looked different than she had in my childhood, smaller, softer, around the edges, less armoured. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, nothing designer or expensive. Her hair was grey at the roots, and she hadn't bothered to cover it. "Thank you for reaching out," she said after we'd ordered our drinks. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," I admitted. "But I realised I need something from you, and I couldn't ask for it without seeing you." Her face tensed, preparing for another confrontation. "What do you need?" "Permission to stop needing your permission," I said. "I need to know that if I move forward with my life, if I stop carrying anger and just live freely without you at the centre of my story, that's okay. That I'm not abandoning some duty or failing some test." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "Ashley, you don't need my permission for that. You never did. That's what I spent 18 years stealing from you, the right to live without needing me to validate every choice." "I know," I said, "but I'm taking it back now. I'm giving myself permission to be happy without guilt, to be successful without needing you to witness it, to love you at a distance without that meaning I've failed at being your daughter." "You've never failed at anything," my mother said softly. "Except maybe at understanding how extraordinary you've always been. But that was my fault, not yours. I taught you to doubt yourself because I doubted myself." We sat there for over an hour talking about small things, her volunteer work at the library, my latest design project, Mark's decision to start doing volunteer plumbing work for low-income families. Safe topics that let us practice being two people who cared about each other without all the weight of history crushing every word. When we parted, she hugged me, brief and careful, but real. "I'm proud of you," she said. "I know I don't have the right to be, but I am." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. Not because I needed her pride, but because I could receive it without it defining me. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months. I thought I'd finally found the key to letting go, to moving forward, to building a life defined by what I chose rather than what I'd survived. But before I could close that chapter, fate gave me one final test. The call came 3 weeks after that coffee meeting with my mother on a Tuesday evening, while Mark and I were cooking dinner together. My phone buzzed on the counter, Lily's name flashing on the screen. I almost didn't answer. We had a policy at work that personal calls happened during work hours, and Lily had been scrupulous about respecting that boundary. But something made me pick up. "Ashley." Lily's voice was shaking, high-pitched with panic. "Ashley, you need to come to Cleveland Clinic right now. It's Mum. She collapsed at the library. They think it's a stroke." The wooden spoon I'd been holding clattered into the sink. Mark looked up sharply from the vegetables he was chopping, already reading the crisis in my face. "How bad?" I managed to ask. "I don't know. They're running tests. Dad and I are here, but she keeps asking for you. She keeps saying your name." Lily's voice cracked. "Please, Ashley. I know things are complicated, but please, come." I hung up and stood frozen in our kitchen, my hand still on the counter, my mind refusing to process what I'd just heard. A stroke? My mother had stroke. My mother, who was 61 years old and had just started rebuilding her life, might be dying. "We need to go," Mark said, already turning off the stove, already grabbing his keys. "I don't know if I should," I said, and was startled by how small my voice sounded. "I don't know if I can handle this. We just started to get to a good place where I could breathe, where I wasn't carrying so much, and now, your mother is in the hospital asking for you," Mark said gently. "And you need to decide who you want to be in this moment. I don't want to be the dutiful daughter who comes running every time there's a crisis," I said, and I heard the edge of panic in my own voice. "I don't want to fall back into that pattern of putting her needs before mine, of sacrificing my peace for her comfort. "That's not what this is," Mark said, crossing to me and taking both my hands in his. "Going to the hospital isn't about being dutiful or sacrificing your peace. It's about making a choice you can live with later, not for her, for you." I stood there in our kitchen, frozen with indecision for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My mind was racing through scenarios, through possibilities, through the calculations of what I owed and what I didn't, what was fair and what was kind, and what would heal me and what would hurt me. "What if this is just another manipulation?" I said finally. "What if I go there and she's fine, and this was just a way to force me to come running? Or what if I go and she dies anyway, and all I have are more complicated feelings and no resolution?" "What if you don't go?" Mark asked quietly. "Can you live with that choice?" I thought about it, really thought about it. Imagined getting a call tomorrow or next week that my mother had died and I hadn't gone. Imagined living the rest of my life knowing I'd chosen anger over presence in her final hours. Imagined becoming the kind of person who lets someone die alone because they hadn't earned my forgiveness yet. "I'll regret it," I whispered. "If I don't go, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I should have, even if she doesn't deserve my presence, even if this is just more drama, even if it changes nothing, I'll regret not going." "Then we go," Mark said simply. "Not because you have to, not because she deserves it, but because you'll regret being cruel later. You'll never regret being kind." The drive to the hospital was silent, my mind too full of conflicting emotions to make words. Part of me was already grieving, not for my mother, as she was, but for all the versions of us that might have existed if she'd been braver or I'd been born into a different family. Part of me was angry that even now, even after months of careful boundary setting and tentative healing, she could still pull me back into her orbit with one crisis. Part of me was just terrified of what I'd find when I got there. The emergency room waiting area was harsh, with fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic. My father was pacing near the windows, his face grey and haggard. Lily sat in a plastic chair, her professional work clothes rumpled, mascara smudged under her eyes. They both looked up when Mark and I entered, and the relief on their faces was so naked it hurt to see. "They've got her stabilised," my father said, immediately coming toward me. "It was a stroke, but they caught it fairly quickly. The next 72 hours are critical," they said. "They need to see how much brain function—" His voice broke. "She keeps asking for you. They're only letting in one visitor at a time, and she won't settle until she sees you." I looked at Lily, who nodded confirmation. "She's scared, Ashley. I've never seen her scared before, but she's scared now. And you're the only one she wants." A nurse came through the double doors, checking her clipboard. "Family of Margaret Reed? We can let one person back for a brief visit." Everyone looked at me. My father, who'd been married to her for 38 years. Lily, who'd spent her whole life trying to be the perfect daughter. And me, the one who'd been dismissed and diminished and finally chose to walk away. "Go," my father said softly. "She needs to see you." I followed the nurse down sterile corridors, through double doors that whispered shut behind us, into a room that smelled of medicine and fear. My mother lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, hooked up to monitors that beeped steadily, an IV in her arm. Her face was slack on one side, and when she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "Ashley," she said, and the word was slurred, difficult. Her right arm lifted slightly, reaching toward me. I moved to her bedside, took her hand, the one that was still working properly. Her grip was weak, but desperate. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, each word an effort. "You were always stronger than me." The first weeks were the hardest. My mother was transferred from the emergency room to the stroke unit, then to a rehabilitation facility, where she would relearn basic tasks: how to grip a fork, how to form words clearly, how to walk without leaning too heavily to one side. The woman who'd spent her life controlling every detail of her appearance and environment was now dependent on nurses to help her bathe and physical therapists to guide her through exercises that exhausted her. I came every Saturday afternoon, not because I was obligated to, but because I'd made a promise to myself, not to her, that I would see this through, that I wouldn't let fear or old resentments keep me from being the kind of person I wanted to be. At first, we didn't talk much. I'd sit in the chair beside her bed while she dozed or stared at the television without really watching it. Sometimes I'd read while she did her physical therapy, offering quiet encouragement when the therapist praised her progress. Sometimes we just sat in silence, and that was okay too. "You don't have to keep coming," she said one afternoon about 3 weeks into her recovery. Her speech had improved, but still came slowly, each word carefully formed. "I know you have your own life." "I'm not here because I have to be," I said. "I'm here because I choose to be. There's a difference." She looked at me for a long moment, something like wonder in her eyes. "I never learned how to choose," she said finally. "I only learned how to endure." It was during the second month, when she'd moved from the rehab facility to a long-term care centre for continued therapy, that she asked for paper and envelopes. Her right hand was still weak, but she'd been practicing writing with her left, the letters shaky and childlike, but legible. "I want to write apologies," she said. "Real ones, to the people I hurt." "That's going to be a lot of letters, huh?" I said, not unkindly. "I know." She met my eyes. "Will you help me?" So we began the work of accounting for decades of cruelty. She'd dictate what she wanted to say, and when her hand grew too tired, I'd write for her. We started with Mark a long letter acknowledging not just that she'd been wrong about his potential, but that she'd actively tried to destroy his future because his dreams threatened her narrow worldview. Then came the former students. We found names through old university records, through LinkedIn searches, through Facebook. Some had changed their names through marriage, some had moved across the country, but my mother was determined to reach as many as she could. "Dear Dr. Patel," one letter began, "you probably don't remember me, but I was your business ethics professor in 2009. You proposed a business plan for medical technology that would make healthcare more accessible in rural areas. I told you it was impractical, that you were naive about market realities. I gave you a failing grade and discouraged you from pursuing that path. I was wrong. I saw today that you founded a company doing exactly what you'd envisioned, and it's helping thousands of people. I crushed your dream because I was too afraid to dream myself. I'm sorry." Each letter was specific, detailed, owning exactly what she'd done and why. No excuses, no minimizing, just clear acknowledgement of harm caused. I helped her mail them one by one, and we never knew which ones reached their destinations or how they were received. She didn't write them expecting forgiveness. She wrote them because the weight of what she'd done had become unbearable, and the only thing left was to name it honestly. Some people wrote back. A few were gracious, thanking her for the apology and wishing her well in her recovery. Others were less kind, explaining in detail how her words had damaged them, how years of therapy had been needed to undo her casual cruelty. My mother read every response carefully, accepting each one without defensiveness. "I deserve these," she said after reading a particularly harsh reply. "I deserve every bit of anger they feel." "Probably," I agreed. "But you're doing the work anyway. That counts for something." The painting came to me during one of my trips back to the attic. I'd been helping my father sort through their remaining belongings before they gave up the storage unit, another cost they couldn't afford. Tucked behind a box of old tax returns, I found it the watercolour I'd painted at age 10, a somewhat abstract rendering of our family in our garden. I'd painted my mother in the centre, surrounded by flowers, smiling. I'd captured some idealised version of her that existed only in my child's imagination, the mother I'd wanted rather than the mother I had. I'd been so proud of it that I'd brought it home from school and presented it to her like a treasure. She'd looked at it for maybe 3 seconds before saying, "The perspective is all wrong and those proportions make no sense. Maybe stick to something more practical than art." I'd found it in the trash that evening, torn in half. I'd carefully taped it back together and hidden it in my room, but eventually it had found its way to the attic, to this box of forgotten things. Now, holding it again decades later, I could see all its flaws. The childish technique, the amateur composition, the overly bright colours. But I could also see what it represented, a moment when I tried to show my mother love through creation, and she'd rejected it because it didn't meet her standards. I brought it to the care facility the following Saturday. My mother was sitting up in bed working on a crossword puzzle with her left hand, her right still resting uselessly in her lap. "I found something," I said, pulling the painting from my bag, "from the attic." She looked at it, and I watched her face go through a series of emotions, recognition, confusion, and then something that looked like grief. "You kept it," she whispered. "After I threw it away, you kept it." "I taped it back together," I said. "I couldn't understand why you didn't want it. I thought maybe I'd done something wrong, painted it wrong somehow." "You didn't do anything wrong," my mother said, her voice thick. "I threw it away because it showed me what you saw when you looked at me, someone kind and happy and worthy of being at the centre of your world. And I knew I wasn't that person. I knew I was failing you, and seeing what you wished I could be was too painful. So I destroyed it rather than try to become it." I moved closer, holding out the painting. "I thought you might want it back now." She reached for it with her left hand, the good one, and held it carefully as if it might disintegrate. Tears streamed down her face, collecting in the slack side of her mouth. "I wasted so much time," she said. "So many years of hurting you when I could have been loving you. And now I'm broken, and it's too late to be the mother you painted." "It's not too late to try," I said softly. My mother held the painting and cried deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from a place she'd kept locked away for decades. It was the first time I'd seen her mourn who she could have been. The painting remained taped to the wall beside my mother's bed, slightly crooked, from where she'd insisted on hanging it herself with her left hand. Every time I visited, I'd find her looking at it sometimes, smiling sadly, sometimes just staring, as if trying to decode a message from her younger self. The visits had become easier over the past month. We'd developed a rhythm that felt almost comfortable. I'd arrive on Saturday afternoons with coffee from the cafe she liked, and we'd talk about small things, her physical therapy progress, Lily's growing confidence at work, the books my mother was reading now that she had so much time. We avoided the deep waters most days, content to wade in the shallows where it was safe. But 3 months into her recovery, during a visit that started like any other, my mother said something that changed the current between us. "I need to tell you something," she said, her speech still slow but clearer than it had been. "Something I should have told you years ago." I set down my coffee and gave her my full attention. She was sitting up in bed, the afternoon light making her look older and more fragile than I wanted to acknowledge. "I loved you by controlling you," she said, "because that's the only love I knew. My mother did the same to me. She controlled every aspect of my life, who I saw, what I studied, where I went. She told me it was because she loved me, because she wanted what was best for me. And I believed her. Even when I resented it, I believed her." She paused, gathering strength, or courage, or both. "When I had you, I swore I'd be different. I'd be the mother my mother never was, supportive, encouraging, present. But the first time you wanted to do something on your own, something that didn't include me, I felt this terror, this absolute certainty that if you left, you'd never come back. Just like I left my mother and never really came back. So you kept me close by making me small," I said quietly. "Yes," she admitted. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was keeping you safe from disappointment and failure and the cruelty of the world. But really, I was just afraid. Afraid of being alone. Afraid of being forgotten. Afraid of becoming my mother, a bitter woman whose children visited out of duty rather than love. I watched her struggle with these words, this honesty that came too late but still mattered. Did you ever think, I asked carefully, that by trying so hard not to become your mother, you became exactly like her? She smiled a sad, knowing smile. Every single day, especially after you stopped coming to family dinners, I'd think, this is it. This is what my mother felt when I pulled away. And instead of changing, I just doubled down. I told myself you were being difficult, that you were ungrateful, that I'd done my best, and it wasn't my fault you didn't appreciate it. But you knew that wasn't true, I said. Yes, she whispered. I always knew. We sat in silence for a while after that, the weight of generations of broken love settling between us. Finally, I reached into my bag and pulled out the album I'd been working on for weeks. I made something for you, I said, handing it to her. She opened it carefully with her working hand, and I watched her face as she turned the pages. It wasn't the carefully curated family album she'd maintained throughout my childhood, the one where everyone smiled perfectly and every moment was staged. This was real. Photos of me as a baby, her looking exhausted and uncertain. Pictures from school plays where I was blurry in the background. The few candid shots where we actually looked happy together before I was old enough to disappoint her. And then, toward the end, the wedding photos. Not the ones that had gone viral, but the simple ones Mark and I had taken on our phones. Us laughing, us dancing, us beginning a life together. You weren't there in person, I said softly, but you're still my mother. And I wanted you to have this, not the version of our family you tried to create, but the real one, messy and complicated and imperfect. My mother traced the photos with her fingertips sliding down her cheeks. When she reached the wedding photos, she stared at them for a long time. You look happy, she finally said, truly happy. The kind of happy I never learned how to be. You could still learn, I said. She looked up at me then, and something in her expression told me she didn't believe that she'd made her peace with who she'd been and who she'd never become. Ashley, she said, reaching for my hand with her good one. I took it, feeling how light it had become, how fragile. I need you to promise me something. What? Promise me you'll be everything I was too afraid to be. That you'll dream big and fail spectacularly and get back up and try again. That you'll let people love you without making them small first. That you'll have children someday and let them fly away when they're ready, even if it breaks your heart. Promise me you'll be brave where I was a coward. Mum, please, she said, gripping my hand tighter than I thought she was capable of. I need to know that this ends with you. That the cycle breaks here. That all this pain and fear and control doesn't get passed on to another generation. Promise me. I promise, I said, my voice breaking. She smiled then, a real smile, the kind I'd rarely seen from her. You were always stronger than me. I saw it when you were small and it terrified me. But now, I'm so grateful for it. You're going to be fine, Ashley. Better than fine. She held my hand and closed her eyes, exhausted from the conversation. I sat with her until she fell asleep, watching her breathe, memorizing the moment because some part of me knew it was important. Those were the last clear words she spoke to me. Be everything I was too afraid to be. Over the next 3 days, she declined rapidly. Another small stroke, the doctors said, and then complications from pneumonia. My father, Lily, and I took turns sitting with her, but she was mostly unconscious, drifting somewhere between sleep and whatever comes after. She passed peacefully on a Tuesday morning early, before any of us had arrived for the day. The nurse called to tell us she'd simply stopped breathing, that it had been gentle and quiet, that she hadn't seemed to be in pain. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot after I got the news, not crying, just feeling the strange weight of finality. My mother was gone. The person who'd shaped me through her absence of love as much as her presence of criticism. the woman who'd stolen my future and then spent her last months apologizing for it. The mother I'd never quite had but also never quite lost. And I realized something sitting there in the morning sun. Forgiveness had already happened. Not in a dramatic moment of reconciliation or a tear-filled embrace. It had happened in the silence between us, in the weekly visits, in the letters we'd mailed together, in the painting on her wall, and the album in her hands. It had happened slowly, imperfectly, in small gestures, repeated until they became something larger. I'd forgiven her not because she'd earned it, but because holding on to anger was heavier than letting it go. 3 days later, she passed peacefully in her sleep, and I realized forgiveness had already happened in the silence between us. The funeral home was too warm and smelled of lilies and carpet cleaner, that particular combination that exists only in spaces designed for grief. My father had wanted something small and private, given everything that had happened, but I'd insisted we make it public. Not because my mother deserved a public farewell, but because hiding felt like continuing the pattern of shame and secrets that had defined too much of her life. People came, more than I'd expected. Some of her former colleagues from her teaching days looking uncomfortable but present. A few women from the library where she'd volunteered crying quietly in the back row. Former students, not the ones she'd crushed, but others who remembered her differently, who'd apparently found her guidance helpful in their own journeys. Mark sat in the front row beside me, his hand warm and steady in mine. Lily sat on my other side, dressed in black, her face composed, but her hands twisting a tissue into shreds. My father sat slightly apart from us, alone in his grief, in the way he'd been alone for most of his marriage present, but not quite participating. I wondered if he was mourning my mother or mourning the life they'd never quite managed to build together. The service was simple. No religious platitudes. My mother hadn't believed in God, only in control and appearances. A pianist played something classical and forgettable. The funeral director said words about loss and memory that could have applied to anyone. Then it was my turn. I'd rewritten the eulogy 5 times, trying to find the balance between truth and kindness. Mark had read each version, and his only advice had been, write what you need to say, not what you think people want to hear. I stood at the lectern with my notes in front of me, looking out at the faces of people who'd known my mother in fragments. The professor, the volunteer, the society woman, the mother. None of them had known all of her. I'm not sure anyone ever had, even me. My mother was not a perfect person. I began, and I heard a few people shift uncomfortably. She made mistakes that hurt people, including me. She let her own fears and wounds shape how she treated others, and the damage she caused was real and lasting. I paused, looking down at my notes, then decided to speak from my heart instead. But perfection isn't what makes someone worthy of being mourned. My mother was a woman who grew up in a time and place that didn't give her room to be who she might have been. She was brilliant, truly brilliant, but she was taught that brilliance in women was something to apologize for or hide. She had dreams, but she was told those dreams were impractical. So she did what she thought she was supposed to do. She made herself smaller, made herself safe, made herself acceptable. I could see my father crying now silently, his shoulders shaking. Lily reached over and took his hand. And then she became a mother, I continued, and she did to her daughters what had been done to her. She tried to keep us small and safe and acceptable, not because she didn't love us, but because she'd learned that love meant control, that keeping someone close meant making sure they never flew too far away. My voice cracked, but I pushed through. In her last months, my mother did something remarkable. She looked at the life she'd lived and decided it wasn't too late to acknowledge the harm she'd caused. She wrote apology letters. She did the hard work of recovery, not just physically, but emotionally. She mourned the person she'd never let herself become and tried in the time she had left to encourage me to be different, to be brave where she'd been afraid, to break the cycle she'd perpetuated. I looked directly at Lily, then at my father. She wasn't perfect. She made mistakes that hurt people, including me. But in the end, she tried. And trying is more than many people ever do. It takes courage to face what you've done wrong, to own it, without excuses to change, even when you know it's too late to undo the damage. My mother found that courage when she was dying, and I respect her for that, even as I grieve for all the years she lived without it. I folded my notes and looked out at the gathered mourners one more time. I hope my mother has found peace. I hope wherever she is, she's finally free of the fear that ruled her life. And I hope that those of us who remain can learn from her mistakes as much as from her final efforts at redemption. That we can be brave enough to love without controlling, strong enough to change even when change is hard, honest enough to admit when we've caused harm and then do the painful work of making it right. I stepped down from the lectern and returned to my seat. Lily grabbed my hand and squeezed hard, tears streaming down her face. My father reached across and placed his hand over both of ours, and for a moment we sat there connected, three people who'd all been damaged by the same woman, all trying to heal from the same wounds. At the cemetery, the November wind was cold and sharp. The priest, my father had insisted on one, even though it felt like theatre, said words about dust and ashes that carried away on the wind before they could land. I stood between Mark and Lily, my father on her other side, and watched as they lowered my mother's casket into the ground. People filed past offering condolences that ranged from sincere to perfunctory. Some of the women from the library hugged me, telling me how much my mother had changed in her final months, how she'd seemed to find some kind of peace in her volunteer work. A few of her former colleagues shook my hand awkwardly, clearly unsure what to say to the daughter of a woman who'd been publicly exposed for decades of cruelty. When everyone had left and only our small family remained, I asked for a moment alone. Mark kissed my forehead and led my father and Lily back to the cars, giving me space for whatever goodbye I needed to make. I stood at the edge of the grave, looking down at the casket, covered in the dirt that was already being shoveled in by the cemetery workers, who waited at a respectful distance. The headstone wouldn't be placed for weeks, but I knew what it would say. Margaret Ann Reed, beloved mother and wife. Simple words that told nothing of the complexity of the woman buried beneath them. I forgive you, I whispered to the ground, to the casket, to whatever remained of the woman who'd given me life, and then spent years trying to control it. Not because you earned it, not because what you did was okay, but because I deserve peace, because I deserve to live without carrying the weight of your fears anymore, because forgiveness isn't about letting you off the hook, it's about freeing myself from the cage we both lived in. The wind picked up scattering leaves across the cemetery grounds. I watched them dance and swirl, untethered and free-going, wherever the wind took them. Thought about my mother's last words. Be everything I was too afraid to be. I will, I said out loud. I'll be brave. I'll be honest. I'll love without controlling. I'll fly even when flying is terrifying. I'll be everything you wanted to be but couldn't, and I'll do it without resentment, without carrying your unlived life on my shoulders. I'll do it for me. I turned to walk away, and as I did, I felt something shift inside me, some weight I'd been carrying for 36 years, finally completely letting go. My mother was gone. The woman who'd shaped me through her fear and her absence, and her final fumbling attempts at redemption, was no longer there to approve or disapprove, to criticize or control, to take up space in my thoughts and my heart. I was free to be exactly who I chose to be. Mark was waiting by the car, his eyes asking if I was okay. I nodded and took his hand, feeling the warmth of it, the solidness of this love that didn't ask me to be smaller or quieter or more acceptable. Lily and my father stood together, and for the first time in our family's history, we looked like people who might actually find a way to care for each other honestly. As we drove away from the cemetery, I looked back once through the rear window. The workers were filling in the grave, returning the earth to where it belonged, and I felt no urge to stay, no pull backward toward what had been. And for the first time in 36 years, I felt truly light. The lightness I felt leaving the cemetery that November afternoon didn't disappear when I returned to ordinary life. If anything, it deepened, became foundational, changed how I moved through the world. I'd spent 36 years carrying the weight of my mother's expectations, my family's disappointments, and my own crushed dreams. Without that weight, I discovered I could actually breathe. Mark and I bought a house in the spring. Nothing like what he could afford, but everything we actually wanted: a modest craftsman with good bones and a yard where we could plant a garden. We spent weekends painting walls and refinishing floors, building something together that belonged to no one's vision but our own. Lily had become something unexpected, a friend. Working together had forced us to actually know each other as adults, rather than as the roles we'd played in our family drama. She was funny, I discovered, with a dry wit she'd always hidden beneath her perfectionism. She was also hard-working in a way that had nothing to do with impressing anyone, and I'd given her 2 raises because she'd genuinely earned them. "I think I'm happy," she'd said one afternoon, looking almost surprised by the admission. "Is this what happy feels like, just contentment without constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop?" "I think so," I'd said. "I'm still figuring it out myself." My father had found his own kind of peace. He'd started attending a men's grief support group at the community centre, and through it he discovered he wasn't the only person who'd spent decades enabling someone else's dysfunction. He'd apologised to me more than once for his passivity for watching my mother crush me and doing nothing to stop it. "I told myself I was keeping the peace," he'd said during one of our monthly coffee meetups. "But really, I was just taking the coward's way out. It was easier to let her be cruel than to stand up to her." "I know," I'd said. "But you're not doing that anymore. That counts for something." It was Mark's idea to start the scholarship fund. We'd been talking one evening about my mother's apology letters, about how many people she'd discouraged from pursuing their dreams. "What if we could undo some of that damage?" he'd said. "Not hers specifically, but that kind of damage. What if we created opportunities for people whose dreams have been blocked by others?" The idea had taken root immediately. We'd worked for months with lawyers and non-profit specialists to create the Second Chances Scholarship Fund, designed specifically for women whose educational or career opportunities had been sabotaged, blocked, or stolen by gatekeepers who'd deemed them unworthy. Women like I'd been, like Mark had been, like so many of my mother's students had been. Lily had asked to work on it. "Let me help run it," she'd said. "Let me do something that actually matters." She'd become the foundation's first employee, coordinating applications, interviewing candidates, managing the selection process. She was good at it, organised, empathetic, driven by a desire to make amends for her own past cruelty by opening doors for others. The magazine interview happened on a warm afternoon in June, exactly 1 year after my wedding. The journalist was a woman in her 40s named Patricia, who'd read about our story and wanted to do a feature for a major women's publication about second chances and unconventional love stories. We sat in our living room, and she asked the questions I'd been expecting. "How did it feel when the truth came out? What was it like to discover your husband was a billionaire? How did your family react?" I answered honestly but carefully, trying to honour the complexity without making it sensational. Then she asked the question that made me pause. "Do you regret how it all happened? If you could go back and change it, have your family at your wedding, avoid all the public drama, skip the pain, would you?" I thought about it carefully, looking around the room at the life Mark and I had built. On the wall hung our wedding photo, that candid shot of us laughing, completely present with each other, surrounded by people who'd chosen to love us. Next to it was the painting I'd made at 10 years old, the one my mother had thrown away, and then cried over in her hospital bed. I'd framed them together deliberately, a before and after, a story of rejection and eventual acceptance. "No," I said finally, and I meant it. That wedding day wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about choosing love over approval. If they'd been there, if they'd approved from the beginning, it would have been their day, their validation, their story. Instead, it was ours, and that made it perfect. Below the framed pictures, Mark had installed a small brass plaque with words I'd written one evening. "He fixed my pipes, but healed my soul." Patricia smiled. "That's beautiful. And now, what's next for you?" "Living," I said simply. "Building a life based on what I choose rather than what I'm recovering from. Helping other women do the same through the scholarship fund. Maybe starting a family of our own someday and breaking the cycle that defined generations before me." After the interview ended and Patricia left, I stood in front of those framed pieces, the wedding photo the child had painting the plaque that told our story in 7 words. Mark came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "You did good today," he said. "She's going to write something meaningful." "I hope so," I said. "I hope someone reads it and realizes they don't have to wait for permission to live their own life. That approval from people who've hurt you isn't necessary for happiness." "You learned that the hard way." "I did," I agreed. "But I learned it, and that's what matters." I thought about my mother's last words. Be everything I was too afraid to be. I'd kept that promise. I was brave in my career, taking on projects that excited me rather than playing it safe. I was honest in my relationships, saying what I meant instead of what I thought people wanted to hear. I was free in my choices, making decisions based on my values rather than anyone else's expectations. Most importantly, I'd learned to see myself clearly, not through the distorted lens of my mother's fears or my family's dismissals, but through my own eyes. I saw a woman who'd survived being made small and chose to grow anyway. A woman who'd been told she was ordinary and decided that ordinary was extraordinary when you lived it authentically. A woman who'd learned that the hardest person to forgive is often yourself, and the greatest gift you can give yourself is the freedom to simply be. True worth isn't measured by who sees you, but by how clearly you see yourself. And after 36 years, I finally saw clearly. And that's where my story ends, or perhaps where it truly begins. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't making people regret what they did to you. It's living so fully, so authentically, that their opinion simply stops mattering. My mother spent years trying to keep me small, and in the end, I became everything she was too afraid to be. Not because I wanted to prove her wrong, but because I finally gave myself permission to be right. The scholarship fund has helped 23 women so far. 23 people who were told they weren't good enough, smart enough, worthy enough. 23 dreams that someone tried to crush now flourishing. Lily tells me that's the part of this story that matters most. And maybe she's right. Maybe the point isn't what was done to us, but what we choose to do with the pain we've survived. If you're watching this and you've ever been told you're too ordinary, too unrealistic, too much, or not enough, I want you to know something. The people who try to make you small are usually fighting their own fears. Their judgment says everything about them and nothing about you. You don't need their approval to live extraordinarily. You just need your own courage. Thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't easy to share, but if it helps even one person stop waiting for permission to live their own life, it was worth it. If this resonated with you, please subscribe to hear more stories like mine. And I'd love to know, in the comments, have you ever had to choose between someone's approval and your own happiness? How did you find the courage to choose yourself? Your story matters, and I'd be honoured to hear it. Until next time, remember that you're enough exactly as you are. You always were.